How do you keep something secret? You hide it in plain sight.
There were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes, also some were alive.
I said, well, you're going to tell the public about it. And he says, no, we don't tell the public about this. It would panic the public.
And you know, there's a new name. It's unexplained aerial phenomenon.
I'm a doctor in an ER taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks. And I'm being asked to brief the CIA director on stuff because he and the president are being lied to? What?
And he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And I said, whose?
If the average person knew that the term UFO was actually concocted after they knew that they were extraterrestrial vehicles or man-made anti-gravity devices, they would realize that for 60 years we've already had the solution to the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, and global poverty. The most dangerous thing going on the planet today isn't ISIS, it's not Iraq, it's not Russia, it's not China. It's a out-of-control, covert group that is not being overseen by the people, the Congress, or the president, who have developed these technologies and are recklessly using them to track and target extraterrestrial vehicles. The result of this is that we're in a crisis that is unacknowledged, ironically, because these projects are unacknowledged.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
There is no threat, and we have to prevent the weaponization of space.
So either they don't exist, but if they are, they're a threat. So this is the 1-2 punch that's been going on, unfortunately, for 60-some years. He said, do you know why they killed Marilyn?
Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe.
And I said, well, I didn't until I got this document. It's a virtual death warrant.
When they found out that Tesla had passed away, they came in, they had the manager of the hotel open the safe, and they took all of Tesla's papers.
Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, that's an urban myth or a conspiracy theory. I say, like the hell it is. This is like a bad, conspiracy novel, except this became my life. The purpose of this meeting is to provide an update, but also a really big overview of the projects we're involved with, particularly dealing with the technology in free energy sector, because there's a lot of misunderstandings in the public on that. And this will be shared with the public via YouTube and the internet. And the reason for it is that there's a big learning curve to understanding the technology, but more importantly, to understanding the policy issues, the national security issues, the details of how you evaluate these technologies, and moving through the minefield of claims that are out there on the internet in particular, which has become a huge problem in the last year for us. So I want to first give you sort of the big picture. And the big picture is that we haven't needed fossil fuels since about 100 years ago. This building was built in 1913. Certainly by then, Tesla, Faraday, Maxwell, particularly the Maxwell-Quaternion equations that were chopped off and changed, as you may well know, some of you who are engineers, has resulted in us having an energy sector that requires us to burn something or heat something up to create steam to get us electricity or to run our cars. However, 100 years of really advanced physics, which weren't that well understood 100 years ago in terms of very high voltage systems at certain resonant high hertz, they call it, cycles per second. We'll get into this later, would result in this excess power. And it was observed by Faraday, and it was observed by Tesla, and it was observed by many others, and said, where is this coming from? Professor Dirac, D-I-R-A-C, said, well, he called it the Dirac Sea. And of course, Tesla called it the sea of the ocean of infinite energy. And it's been called various things. The modern term is the 0-point energy field. And as many of you may know, one of the writers for Jane's Defense Weekly, Mr. Cook, wrote an article about this, Jane's Defense Weekly being a very big defense journal out of Great Britain, very prestigious journal, and then wrote a book called The Hunt for 0 Point, which I recommend, based on a lot of information that we had begun to put out, and particularly as it applies to propulsion. All right. So if you create this kind of vector into the 0-point energy field, and you create a certain counter-rotating vortex, let's call it, which is almost a Sufi-like phenomenon, you get what's called lift, and you get a phenomenon that's known as electromagnetogravitics. Now, the pop culture would call it anti-gravity, which is really not correct. What you're really doing when you see a UFO moving and it's going straight up 10,000 miles per hour against gravity is that it's actually in a space-time bubble. It's creating its own environment, shall we say. So there's no restrictions to normal aerodynamic formula. And so the thing can lift and go straight up at those velocities. And if it goes through another level, that the entire object, the mass of the entire object, can become massless. And this has to do with things that are very technical that we'll get into a little bit later if you're interested in the technical part of this, which I think is fascinating. And that's when you enter into what's called the transdimensional physics, when something moves from one dimension to another, or transverses one dimension to another. By definition, all interstellar vehicles are transdimensional. Let me repeat that. If it's interstellar, it is transdimensional. It is not getting here at a subluminal or below the speed of light velocity. This is a key understanding because most people will say, well, maybe they're interdimensional or maybe they're interstellar. And I'm going, you don't understand the physics of this. If it's interstellar and it's here, meaning it somehow went from another star system to here, and someone's lifespan, a creature's lifespan, even if you live to be 800 years old, it's got to be faster than the speed of light. But the term faster than the speed of light is a misnomer because you're no longer bound by the physics of the speed of light or even the normal vacuum of space that we think of, because you've resonantly shifted into these, if you will, parallel universes or enfolded universes transdimensionally, and then you step back down into this one. Too much information? All right. So this is the key thing that people have to understand and began to be studied. Now, in the early days, let's go back to the time of Tesla. They were observing with usually DC power systems, direct current, as opposed to alternating current, which we use in our homes, which Nikola Tesla invented or came up with. That would have this effect where a certain amount of energy would go into a system, more would come out. It wasn't really accepted until Dr. Casimir, a physicist named Casimir, and the Casimir effect, where this was published in mainstream physics journals, by the way, proved that there was this 0-point energy field, that there was this energy that was left even after you cooled down all the atoms and all the activity in the universe down to absolute zero, which is a specific temperature. And there's still this energy there. And that 0-point energy field, as it turns out, is embedded everywhere in space, not outer space, here in this room. So that every cubic centimeter of space in this room, for example, has enough power to run at least the United States for a day. a cubic centimeter. So it's an enormous field of energy. So running our planet on this energy field would be like taking a thimble out of the Great Lakes or something of water. It's a trivia, it's a rounding error. However, as J.P. Morgan famously was reported to have said to Nikola Tesla when he had a car that had a little antenna on it that was running around where the batteries were charging themselves, J.P. Morgan said, if we can't put a meter on it, we don't want it. Big bankers. Now, 100 years ago or 90 years ago to today, nothing's really changed in terms of the geopolitical, financial, macroeconomic exigencies. And that's the huge problem. Is there a technical challenge? Yes. And we'll get into how we can mount a sort of effort together to come up with a modern day version of what Tesla had. But the geopolitical, macroeconomic policy issue is the big problem. And it isn't just because there are a few bankers and kleptocrats that are misanthropic sociopaths, although some of them are. It's because there are a lot of stakeholders who don't want to have to deal with the change. I remember my military advisor once meeting with an admiral who was in charge of CONUS, Continental United States Security, saying, well, this is all wonderful, and I know that those technologies do exist in classified programs. It's too big of a change for me to have to deal with. I just want to see that everything stays in sort of a homeostasis. We don't rock the boat too much, and I retire from this command and get to go fishing at my place in Montana. No, really. All right. So having had dozens and dozens of meetings personally with people like that in the national security structure in Washington, in the United Kingdom, from France, and elsewhere, there is this consistent refrain of, this is a great thing, but it's too big of a change. It's too big of a challenge. And therefore, if it's that big of a challenge, it's better just to kick the can down the road and let someone else deal with it later. So there's been 100 years of kicking the can down the road. Meanwhile, to give you a very big picture of how much trouble we have at this point, we have a geopolitical order where our vital national security interests, which is a mantra here in Washington, is an actual phrase for oil, protecting the oil interest. The madness going on in the Ukraine and Crimea right now is 100% or largely influenced by natural gas and oil politics. Certainly the Middle East, anyone knows that is. People say, well, there's Israel there. I say, yes, but they have a couple hundred thermonuclear weapons and can take care of them. I know for a fact they do. So the big problem becomes if you have, let's say in 1927 or so, 1927, there were 2 billion people in the world. Now there's 7. So of those 2 billion people, there were very few people living with cars and electricity in their homes and et cetera and so on. Now you have 7 billion people and billions more people living on that system, which has become entrenched, bureaucratically built into our funding mechanisms from the state, local, federal level of support, and also where there are a lot of very powerful stakeholders. And so from a rational point of view, you'd say, well, these technologies would get us off of oil, gas, nuclear power, no more Fukushimas. But from the point of view of people who are looking at the national security equation from a macroeconomic stability point of view, this is their worst nightmare. Up the road here, between here and the White House, if you walk straight up the road here, you'll end up at the White House. It's at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and we're on 16th Street. I was at the University Club with a man who was sort of the consigliere for President Bush Jr., W, a few years ago. And we were having dinner, and this is a place, you'd have Rumsfeld there and other people there, in this place having dinner or lunch. It's a private club. I don't belong to it, but I was invited. Actually, I had to put on a jacket. I was shocked and appalled. Anyway, so I did. And, he said, look, you have to understand that everyone who gets into that house, pointing to the White House, becomes governs as a conservative. From the point of view of the classic definition, don't change anything. Conserve. Don't change. Keep things as they are. Tradition. Because when you're dealing with a change this large, this is what the people call a disruptive technology, but writ large. And disruptive technology writ large in this, how I'm speaking of it, is something that would have a multi-hundred trillion dollar impact. Not billion, trillion. So let me repeat that, multi-hundred trillion dollar impact. Because once this is disclosed, and this backs into why, quote, UFOs are secret and forbidden to talk about in polite circles, is that a UFO is really just a misnomer for an alternative energy and propulsion device. All right? They are not moving using Exxon Jet A fuel. All right? They're not using a nuclear reactor on those little things. They're using this whole new area of physics, which is elegant, beautiful, life-sustaining for the planet. But if you said those were real, people would say, oh, how are they moving like that? Any physicist at MIT would ask this question if they thought it was real and hadn't been brainwashed by the psychological warfare disinformation campaign launched by the CIA in 1953. So that's the problem, is that if you begin to talk about the phenomena of new energy, free energy, anti-gravity, UFOs, you're stepping into an area that is the most sensitive, compartmented intelligence in the history of the United States. There was a time when I was willing to kind of play along with some of these inventors with their secret proclivities. That was a decade ago. At this point, the answer is no, yet, never, ain't gonna happen. And the reason is, if I know what the result is going to be at the end, you'd be insane to start it at the beginning. All right? So it isn't for nothing that since 1992 and 1993, I've been having meetings and doing briefings for the head of Army Intelligence and the CIA director and putting together presidential briefings and moving around with, getting Rockefeller to host the Clintons at the ranch to go through all this stuff with them. Some of this you know, some you don't. But you learn through those lessons. And what I have learned is where I started. Disclosure, complete openness about all these technologies. You cannot fix this problem from the consciousness that created it. And greed, avarice, secrecy, that's what's gotten us where we are. That is at the core of the massive oil, fossil fuel, national security superstate that we have built up around us. So if you use that same consciousness, you're not going to escape from that black hole. So we have to have a whole new consciousness that guides these endeavors, or we're going to repeat history over and over and over and over again. And that is the great tragedy of our time, is that because this subject is sort of the stepchild of science, and there has been a divide and conquer nature to all these inventors who, one will pop up in England, one will pop up like Stan Meyer in the Midwest, one will pop up in Australia, one will pop up in South America. And there are all these sort of lone wolves out there that are easy to pick off one at a time. So we have to come together as a people and do this very overtly, not secretively, with a proper public involvement, because the public wants this. 99.9% of the people on planet Earth would benefit from this. There is a very, it's not the 1%, it's the 0.0000001% who would not benefit from this because they are the ones sitting atop the petrodollar system, the macroeconomic order, and particularly the fact that it is run, and everything we're using is run on a metered linear energy source, even solar and wind. The big $2 billion solar farm being done out in the desert of California. I mean, that's a huge thing, but it's all centralized with a centralized utility. What happens when you have something that would fit on this table and it will run your house? Pulling energy from the quantum vacuum or the zero-point energy field. You don't need utilities. How many people have stock portfolios with utilities in them? Bye-bye. You don't need ExxonMobil. You don't need BP. You do not need coal. So there goes all of Australia's coal exports to China. Unnecessary. Don't need it. On and on and on and on it goes. So there would be an impact. But if we don't do it, the impact we're facing is 1,000 times worse, which is a geopolitical order where you're likely to see a war in the South China Sea over oil deposits, where we have this situation now in the Ukraine and Crimea and with Russian gas and Europe needing it, the Middle East conundrum, on it goes. So beneath that is a deeper crisis. True statistic, 48% of inhabitants of Earth do not have indoor plumbing. So the old saying, don't have a pot to pee in, literally 48% of the 7 billion people on Earth. So we have this growing disparity between the people who have things and those who do not. But that is what happens, and it gets very extreme before every massive global revolution or war, like in the 1920s before the Third Reich rose. I think we have to begin to look at this and say, how can we stay on this path when the outcome is huge problems with the environment? Even if you don't believe in climate change as a result of fossil fuel, these other issues are going to catch us before that does. So long before we have a problem with the climate, which actually we're having a problem, the UN report that came out this week makes it quite clear. But even if you don't accept that in your paradigm, the inhumanity of keeping these sciences and technologies away from the public and the poverty that it engenders. Because I was talking to an industrialist from India, and he was telling me it would take trillions of dollars to properly electrify the subcontinent so that people have the energy they need using today's conventional systems, even solar, even wind, even coal. And you know, we're facing a situation now that every year or two there's 1,000 new coal-fired burning power plants being put online in India, China, and elsewhere, mostly without any scrubbers. So in the Pacific Northwest and other places, you have a huge amount of the pollution that's in the West Coast is coming from Asia because there's no scrubbers in those coal. And you look at the air in Beijing and Shanghai and other cities, it's not breathable. Then you go to the oceans, where you have the Fukushima reactor releasing all this radioactive material, and huge parts of the oceans, because there's all the CO2 going into the oceans, are beginning to die because of the acidity and alkaline levels being upset. So there are all these big macro geophysical effects while we're trying to maintain the current macroeconomic order. Big problem, huge mistake. But who's going to fix it? This is really the crux of the problem. Now, many people have asked me, given the folks I've met with over the years, why doesn't someone do that? But see, everyone says that. My wife and I this week were just up in New York meeting with the head of a foundation. And the question came up frequently with people there, all of whom were incredibly wealthy. Well, why doesn't Bill Gates do it? Or why doesn't the president? It's always, why doesn't someone else? Of course, if you go to the president, he'll say, no way, Jose. And if you go to billionaire X and billionaire Y and billionaire Z, many of whom I've met with, they'll go, you know, one of them once said to me, we all want to be first to be second. Great expression. You hear it a lot in business. When it's a very controversial science, no one wants to be the first to stick their neck out. So this becomes then a leadership issue, which is what I've tried to provide some clarity to in my own humble way, being not a significantly wealthy or powerful person at all, but knowing what I know, try to share it with the public and try to create a momentum towards disclosure, not only of the fact that we're not alone in the universe, but that secret behind these UFO propulsion systems and energy systems would give us an entirely new planet. Beautiful. But there are stakeholders who are very, very powerful who aren't happy about that. Now, you know, at the World Economic Forum at Davos a couple of months ago, it came out that there's about 17, they said 35, but it's actually more like 32, and the Swiss Institute said more like 17 people and corporations that those people control that have about the equivalent of the net worth of the lowest 50% of the world's population, which is true. And some of these folks I have met with and briefed over the years, and in fact very recently. As some of you may have heard, I can't go into any details about it, I was asked to go to an island in the last few months with about 120 world leaders and people from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and various people. And I wasn't allowed to bring any assistance, or I could have brought my wife, but it was too, she didn't feel like she didn't like traveling so much. And so I went by myself, and it was daunting. Not because of who was there, but what the task was. Because there were either people there who knew that this existed and were seething that I was on the agenda, or there were people who knew nothing about it and had no foundation for understanding it. And I had 45 minutes to discuss it. Now, you know, that's the nature of these kind of confabs, if you've ever been to any of those sort of things. But we made a lot of progress with that, because the head of this institute that hosts this event every year ended up asking us to take the Disclosure Project 2-hour DVD that has all, you know, dozens and dozens of these military witnesses, and also has the presidential briefing document, the early ones that we put together, in there, embedded in a PDF file, and sent it to the top 50 people who were there. So, and that was just recently, or 30 people. So we're continuing that educational process. But time and time and time again, whether in LA, I was given a talk to a group, and there were about 110 people there, but 12 of them were billionaires. And every single one of them would say, well, I wouldn't want to do something like this, but so-and-so might. And it's kind of like the little red hen, you know? Everyone would like to see this happen. Nobody wants to do it. And so that, you know, it's kind of comical. And I kind of feel like, you know, Lawrence Rockefeller, back in 93, turned to me, or 94, 20 years ago, and he says, don't leave your medical career, because really no one's going to take any risks with something this controversial. And, you know, you'll just end up being the court jester for a lot of the public and a lot of the elites. Not court jester, but, you know, information or infotainment, but no one's really kind of stick their neck out on this because this is too heavy a lift. And I was appalled at his cynicism. And 20 years later, I go, you know, old guy was right. It's sort of a sad view of that situation. But ultimately, I have to take the view that we as a people can still do this. I'm the eternal optimist. You have to be if you're an emergency doctor. You know, you're working everything to save that 3-year-old child. And believe me, you can, and you can't do sometimes. And sometimes you can't. But that's the mindset of an emergency physician. And I think that what we have to look at is what does it take to do something wonderful for our children and our children's children. And it can't be the consciousness of what's in it for me. And that's, of course, the whole concept of venture capital and most technological plays. For example, here's a mistake many people have made. They come up with one of these systems. Maybe it's a prototype that's only putting out 100 watts of, quote, free energy that's coming from the vacuum, i.e. over what's going into it. So say, there's 10 watts going in and 100 watts coming out. I know many people. There's a man at Lawrence Berkeley Labs who had done this. And they get approached by someone who says, oh, well, work with me, and we're a VC group, and here's $50 million for a startup. Guess what? Those folks are either shilling, they're fronting for the intelligence community, or they're sincere, but then someone comes in later with $5 billion and buys them out. I met with such a man not long ago at my home in Virginia, out at our farm, and he says, oh yeah, well, you know, $50 million wouldn't be a problem, but I would want to have control over the corporation and the technology. I said, I don't think that's really a good idea. Have you ever gone mano a mano with the national security state? He says, no, but I've done lots of, you know, apps and, you know, stuff. And, you know, he thought this was like coming out with a new iPhone app. So that's how little he understood about what we're facing here. And I said, well, the problem with that is, let me just ask you a question. If you put $50 million into that research and development program and came out with a prototype of something that would run people's homes, take them off the grid, self-sufficiency, lift the third world out of poverty in 3-4 years, 5 years at the most, with the way technologies can spread today in the world. But someone offered you $5 billion for your $50 million funding. What would you do? He says, I'm a businessman. I would sell. I said, no, you're a money whore. And you have just sold out the future of the world to another front organization that's going to bury it. Now, there's a term for this in our community that I use called black shelving. Black shelving means a corporate interest will buy up a technology because it is a threat to other horizontally and vertically integrated parts of their corporate structure, and just put it on a black shelf and keep it there. Now, there's a man who's a 747 pilot for United Airlines who's retired now, but he grew up with a gentleman who was inventing amazingly efficient carburetors in the 50s that were getting these heavy clunker cars, you know, those great big cars that were running and getting 80, 90 miles per gallon because of some of these electromagnetic things that he was in. Well, the auto companies and the oil companies kept buying him out. And he retired on that money. And his attitude was, I got mine, I'm rich now. One of the scientists, a lieutenant colonel down near the Huntsville Space Flight Center, Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, I was at his home, and he has worked a great deal in this area in classified projects. And he was looking at one. It was a gentleman who had an electromagnetic motor. And he tested it. And this is a PhD physicist, by the way. He said this was the real thing. This was not one of these frauds and tricks that are out there on the internet, most of which we'll get to in a moment are tricks and frauds. And he said this was the real thing. The guy disappeared for a few months. The next time he saw him, the guy had a Lamborghini and Armani suit, seriously, and wouldn't even talk to this physicist and said, I can't talk about that technology. It's been sold. That was in the 80s. That was 30-some years ago. Now there's another part. So if you get past the national security apparatus, there are all these business traps where if the money is initially clean, but the entity is controlled by people who are mainly interested in money and power, they're going to sell to someone who will black shelve it. It's not if that will happen, it's when. Because we have documented that this has happened over and over and over and over and over again. What I'm wanting to share with this first part of the presentation are where are all the pitfalls. Because invariably, if you assert these technologies are possible, any thinking person is going to say, why aren't they out there? I'm trying to provide you with the why. Okay? And also the how. Now you get to our humble efforts. And if you want to know more about the work of T. Townsend Brown and Tesla and many, many, many others, they're on our website, and I'm not going to go through things that you can read there. I want to share things that from our experience that is unique to the access we've had and the experience we've had, which is, as they would say, unique and once in a generation opportunity. So some years ago, many years ago, I met a man who's a senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs down here. If you fly into National Airport, you see all those radar domes. It's the largest Department of Defense lab in the United States. And very senior scientist, like very. You know, puts together stuff for the vice president, puts together stuff for admirals and joint staff and what have you. And I suspect if his name was known, he'd be the most famous aerospace designer of the last 30 years. But everything he's built has been for three-letter agencies, CIA and elsewhere. So he has been very, very interested and supportive of what we're doing. He understands the implications of the secrecy, the dark part. And so a few years ago, we have, as you see on our website, the Orion Project, which was a sort of a group that we put together. We wanted to raise the funds to have our own lab, didn't get enough funds. So what we ended up doing is providing grants to people. Some of them were people who said they could do things they really couldn't. But you know, hey, you don't know. We're in a world emergency here, as I see it. So we're saying, like, we're not going to hoard this and sit on it. Let's put it out there. But one of the grants went to this brilliant, writ large engineer who had studied under William S. Bender at the University of Washington, a true genius, who in the 1970s had founded, after his studies, Transdimensional Technologies, a company that was working on these. And he actually did make a generator, energy generating device. I think it was 74, somewhere around there. And that device ended up getting seized by a national security order. And he describes, as if it was yesterday, these thugs in suits with an all access pass badge coming in with a national security order, and they said, you are now working for us, and that technology goes into what's called the vault, and all of your papers go into the vault, and you really don't have a choice. So for the last 40 years, he's worked for the national security state through a corporation that I know, and there's the details I don't want to go into for privacy reasons. And he basically does stuff for various agencies through this corporation. And he was introduced to me by this senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs and says, you know what? This gentleman's shepherds, as they're called in the intelligence community, shepherds meaning the people who are holding your security clearances and sort of looking out for what you're doing, and he had 5 of them, have approved him working with you, Dr. Greer, and the Orion Project, and to do a basic prototype, Tesla-type prototype. But he is not allowed to do anything that flies. Because when I had gone down to his lab, and I went down to Huntsville and near the Redstone Arsenal and saw the lab. This gentleman had things that were floating around, nothing attached to them. It looked like miniature UFOs. Pretty cool stuff. The Naval Research Lab spent $1 million beefing that up and had things in their hangars floating around. And I've been in the NRL because people just bring me there because they want me to come in and share what I know, and I'll pick their brains and they'll pick mine. And I do not hold a security clearance, but I will not accept one. I tell people what I'm doing, and we don't want a security clearance. So what happens is that this guy says, look, I'll do this for you in my spare time, because he's still working full time for this corporation doing stuff for the agency and other entities. I said, great, here's, I forget what we gave him, $60,000, $70,000. And about the time he was getting that thing built up, a team was sent down from the DC area to him, met with him in his SCIF, which is a secure communication intelligence facility, SCIF. Basically, it's an underground electromagnetic sealed facility. And in his SCIF, there was a former CIA director who had left the CIA and took a golden parachute into one of the big Beltway bandit corporations here in the DC area. And another team of people that basically threatened him, provided all kinds of false and defaming information about me that was outrageous. I mean, things like, I'm teaching people how to use consciousness to detonate weapons of mass destruction for Al-Qaeda. I mean, just insane stuff. I mean, you cannot imagine the full court press of defamation that attends trying to do something like what I'm doing. And basically, he got hold of us and said, I can't do this. I'm out here trying to do this at my house, in my own private lab. He had a secure lab that had a top secret clearance in his house. But he also had this other facility. But he says, I mean, my immediate intelligence shepherds said I could do this, but these guys have come in and have really threatened us. And I'm shut down. So we lost our money and didn't get anything. So we have done that to the tune of around $950,000 over the last decade. And all the work I've done on it, my family, my associates have all worked pro bono. We've never been paid. And what we have learned from it are some very, very hard lessons that anyone listening to this needs to take to heart. Because there is a very narrow pathway out of the morass we're in. And because we've tried the others. We've tried providing grants to people. We've tried funding people who were not just, someone in a trailer park who had a wild idea. I mean, these were people with the provenance, their credentials. We visited, they've gone all over the world. Now, we have been caught in some outrageous scams. And I want to talk about some of those because the public has an idea that because you put something on YouTube, that's dispositive proof. It is not. It's sort of like my father-in-law used to say, paper does not refuse ink. If you want to just make something up. YouTube doesn't refuse an upload of a video. Nor does the internet refuse digits. You just put it out there. So it's a non-selective filter. Anything is up there. And a two-dimensional viewing on a YouTube is not a 3D proof that it is for real and that it's reproducible. So independent scientific validation and reproducibility, these are the sine qua non of science. And so we want to do this scientifically and very, very rationally. I won't give you an example. In a Latin American country, they went down to Mexico City a few years ago, and they had a device, small, and it was encased in resin or plastic. And you put it between, say, a fan and a wall socket. And you would, without it in there, you'd measure how, it was a kilowatt, you running this fan, a kilowatt of electricity. With it in there, it was only using 100 watts. And it was supposedly saving all this power because it had a secret circuit in there that was pulling energy in from the 0-point field that was solid state. I thought, well, it's theoretically possible. So I schlep down there, look at it, bring one back. We're testing it, sure enough, and it turns out the Southwest Research Institute, which is a very big testing entity in Austin that a lot of mainstream entities use, tested it and gave the same report. And they had that report. So it looked like, well, it had passed muster here. But, big but, B-U-T, nobody knew what was in the little plastic thing. It was sealed, and it was a trade secret. And I went, this is risky, because it may be a trick. So Eugene Malov, who was MIT, had a PhD, MIT, Harvard, who was on our team, who was murdered, as many of you know, a few years ago. And some other scientists, including these folks at NRL and some other facilities, tested this magical power-saving device. And they said, well, sure enough, they're not lying about it. It looks like if you just measure the energy. When we did an MRI scan on it, you know what we found? It had a circuit that was tricking the meter and making the meter run backwards, which can be done. It's called the power phase angle. Any engineers in here? And so very clever, multi-million-dollar scam that had taken, and all it was doing was tricking the power. It was still using the same amount of power. It took untold thousands of dollars, and that was including everyone working for free, all these entities, Eugene Malov, my scientific team, everything, to get to the bottom of this. And that is why we will not pursue anything that is not open, transparent, and completely, if they're not willing to open their kimono fully, we'll say, you keep it and let someone else eat that snake oil. Ain't gonna be us. Now, I hate to be so blunt, but this is where you've really got to understand what we've been through. Now, you take that one example, and we've done that several dozen times all over the world at enormous cost to myself, enormous travel expenses. and in many times where people demand to have X amount put up as a retainer and da-da-da-da-da-da for you to even carry one away, and it's ended up to be this kind of a fraud. Now, this sounds like a real downer, doesn't it? And it is. But if you don't learn from these things, you're going to repeat them, which we will never do. And I'm here to make a very special announcement. That's why we're here in this beautiful ballroom with a few lovely people who randomly were able to get here. Sirius Technology Advanced Research, which is a little group that we found that brought out the film Sirius, and is doing a lot of this work now under that umbrella, is announcing a $100,000 challenge and award available to anyone who can deliver to us here in the Virginia area an operational device that meets certain criteria. Money's in the bank. Go to our website, you see it's been donated or it's there. Now, you say $100,000 isn't much money, but it actually is, because if you look at the fact that right now there is a quantum energy generator that's on the internet, it's supposed to be open source. There is information from the Keshe Foundation. There's information from other things that are now supposedly open source that people are saying. There's YouTube video showing it's doing this. And people have asked me why. In fact, one of our supporters for the Sirius film said, why don't you just go and build one? I said, look, to hook up our DVD player, my wife has to do that. I am such an idiot. You know, give me a defibrillator or a respirator, no problem, but that stuff, no. So look, I'm not a machine guy with a lathe. So we would have to engage someone to do that. And people said, well, then why don't you? I said, because I have several thousand videos and several thousand documents in 2D purporting these claims. And it would take probably $100 million to build them all up. And how do you determine which one is legitimate? So we're turning this around the other way. If it is what people say it is, it's supposed to cost $5,000 to $7,000 to make one of these, even custom lathing, custom. You build it, you bring it, we're not going anywhere, because we've tracked all over the world and it's been just a wild goose chase, to be honest with everyone. We will have it independently tested. And if it is legitimate, it has to have plans with it that are not secret and that nothing has been altered. That would allow us to independently reproduce it by somebody who is not associated with the inventor or the people who are advocates of the technology, truly an independent person. If it is not reproducible, it isn't science, and it isn't going to be made a billion copies to run 7 billion people's homes, cars, and what have you. And if it is not able to be tested transparently until proven otherwise, we're going to have to assume that there's a trick. Now, that's perhaps too harsh, but that's been our experience. And since we have expended almost $1 million already, going all over the world doing this, trying these other approaches, this is the approach that we're willing to go forward with that I think will work. And I think everything else is a waste of time, money, and resources. Now, what are the criteria for getting this award? Okay, number one, it cannot be something running off a wall socket, because there could be a circuit in there tricking the power phase angle. I just explained that. Cannot. If it's running on a battery pack or capacitors or something that starts up the system, those have to be completely recharged from the output while it carries a load. What do I mean by that? Let's say you've got this prototype, proof of principle thing, and it starts up, it needs 500 watts of power to start it up, and it runs, and then it kicks in, and it has a circuit where it is legitimately pulling in from the zero-point energy field, quantum vacuum flux field, if you want to call it that, the Dirac-C, whatever your favorite term is, and it's putting out 5 kilowatts of power. Well, if you have an output of 5 kilowatts, it should be no problem to take out of that 5 kilowatts and put the 500 watts back into the front end so that those batteries stay 100% charged. Got it? I can help design that circuit in my sleep, by the way, even if it has to be a switching circuit between batteries. Some people say, oh, you can't do that because it kills the thing. I said, good, then you put in a switching circuit on the front end batteries, but no tricks. And then it's running 4.5 kilowatts of usable excess electricity to run appliances or what have you. I'm just using this as an example. Now it could be something that only it takes 100 watts in that stays charged from output and a kilowatt's coming out. So you have 900. For a proof of principle thing, it doesn't have to be something that's going to be ready to go to manufacture. It has to be something that I can put in front of the people that I meet with week in and week out and week in and week out who want to see a solution like this. They really do, but they haven't seen it. And when I tell them, well, I've seen them at this SCIF or at this lab, and they go, yeah, but I want to see one. And you know what? The public needs to see one. But they need to see it with independent testing by people who are going to publish and put their name to the fact that I tested this prototype and this is what it is doing. And then another laboratory says, I've taken the plans that were provided for the prototype and I have independently recreated the effect, reproducibility, at least once, if not 3 times, which is what we'd use the rest of the funds for that we've been able to have donated and made through the film series. So the $100,000, we call it the Serious Challenge and Award. And it's $100,000 for anyone who can legitimately bring, we're not going to go to the outback of Australia to look at a kind of, shoulda, product, maybe. It's got to be brought here, not to DC, but to Virginia, near the University of Virginia. And it has got to be able to pass these criteria. It also cannot have anything in it that is hazmat, hazardous material. Now, why do I say that? We have tested and looked at some devices that were using low-level radioactive materials. Not good. You can make a dirty weapon out of that. It's never going to be able to be mass manufactured. So it can't have hazmat. It can't have anything really toxic in terms of hazmat chemicals. It cannot have a effect that is harmful to the environment. So it'll be tested for environmental effects. What do I mean? Well, I mentioned this gentleman who's this incredible trans-dimensional physicist and engineer down near Huntsville. He had a experiment he was doing that actually created a vector and created a space-time bubble. And amazingly, you know, like he accidentally dropped a bolt into this energy field and it vanished. You could put a broom handle into it and that part of it would go into another dimension. This sounds like science fiction. It is not. The senior scientist in Naval Research Labs, who I know very well, who has stayed at our home, I've known him for many years, saw this. But unfortunately, when he was experimenting with that, it created an energy field where a scientist who was standing next to it, half of his body got hit by that. And half of his body is aging at twice the rate of the other half, literally. Sounds like something out of the outer, limits or whatever they used to call that. So these technologies, it has to be something that's safe. It also needs to be something that is not going to disrupt FCC channels, federal communication. In other words, if you switch that on and your local FM radio station goes offline, you're going to get a knock on the door. Or if you switch it on and all cell phones are disabled. Or if you switch it, and this is an effect of these sciences. There's a guy who works in the science director at CIA and that I've known for 20 years. And he says, we have a name for these things, WSFM, weird science and frickin' magic. And my uncle worked on the Apollo landing, the lunar module. And at Northrop Grumman, they just call it PFM, pure frickin' magic. And it's the high end of electromagnetic, mainly magnetic field sciences that result in all kinds of phenomena. So you have to be careful. You have to know what you're doing. And some people have known and some haven't. So there are effects. So it would have to be able to pass the test that there's not a biohazard, an FCC communication hazard to normal bandwidths of cell phones and radio and TV, because you don't, or what have you, or create inadvertently a blackout and electromagnetically in an adjacent building. I know one guy who was experimenting with this, and every time he turned on the system, everyone's garage doors in his neighborhood were going up and down like this. Seriously. So these are all things that have going to have to be evaluated. In 24 years of me being involved with this, I now know what to look for, which someone starting out would take them 24 years to discover. And the device also, meeting this challenge, has to be stable. What do I mean by that? Let's say it works in Massachusetts, but you move it from Massachusetts to Virginia, and the electromagnetic and magnetic field of the Earth is different in Virginia than it is there. And even from place to place, you can go to places in Colorado where there's huge changes in the Gaussian, the measurement of magnetic field at one point versus another, even in one valley. If it works in one point and doesn't work in the other, that's a problem. Unless you've developed an algorithm of how to attune it to adjust for the magnetic field variations that surround Earth. That is a serious technical issue. Believe me, I tell you, I have seen things that absolutely work in one point, you move it, doesn't work. That's not what we call robust. So the technology has to be open source. The person cannot want a patent or want to keep it secret. It has got to be something that can be openly shared with the public. It has to be stable. It has to be free of hazardous effects. It needs to be something that's putting out a measurable over unity amount of power, meaning more than what's going in, with the input power continuously charged. And it needs to be able to run in a stable fashion for a sustainable amount of time. What do I mean by sustainable? At least a day. Now, we were once involved in an operation out of the Caribbean, and a man had sort of resurrected the Tesla Stubblefield earth battery. Everybody know what that is? You put these zinc and copper poles in the earth, and you actually can run. And he had, several hundred watts of electricity coming out of this thing, but it would only work for about 20 minutes, 15 minutes, and then it would go cut off. We went, why? Why is it cutting off in 20 minutes? Something not right. Well, we thought maybe it just needed more engineering. So we took this. It turns out that the electrolyte content of the soil, it took a genius to discover this from documents from Russia from the early part of the 20th century. There has to be a certain electrolyte composition of the soil to feed and be flowing through these copper and zinc alternating pipes for that Stubblefield Tesla battery. We have pictures of it on our website, to operate on a sustainable basis. And that was the secret that the inventor, not the inventor, the guy trying to reproduce it didn't know, but he didn't want to admit he didn't know it. So he started playing a scam on us, which cost us a couple $100,000. So that's why it has to be something that can work on a reliable basis for a sustained amount of time. Because if it conks out in 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, there's something fishy going on. And to troubleshoot that failure could very well cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, literally, to get to the bottom of it with some of the most brilliant people in the world who know this particular area of electromagnetic phenomena. And that's a very, very small number of people that we know of who can actually work on this with us, who aren't assigned to the agency or to Lockheed Skunk Works or what have you. So we have to do this in a way that has our eyes wide open, having learned what we have over the last few dozen or so years. If someone has such a thing, and I'm convinced it's out there, they need to contact us. And there will be on our website an application and a questionnaire so that we can do an initial intake review of it. And then they will be, if it passes all those evaluation criteria, they will be invited to come to have it tested. But they also must leave with it the plan so it can be reproduced. Because if they have, for example, done something that works and it's legitimate, but they do something like Stan Meyer did, where he left out or just changed by a few thousand voltages, what the voltage or the hertz needs to be, no one will be able to reproduce it. And that doesn't help the planet. And we're not willing to do it. It has got to be independently reproducible by not me and not someone who's an advocate of new energy, but just a person who is skilled in the art of fabrication, machining, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, a team that can do that. And if that can't be done, and if the person can't do it, and it also has to be done in a way so that the person isn't going back and forth with the inventor. Because if the plans can't, if they're not truly well thought through plans where a skilled person can do it, like a proper formula, then the science may not be there. It may be a bunch of guesswork where you have to do an iterative thing. And now that we have seen this, where there have been scientists who have stumbled across an effect, but they didn't keep, or they didn't even know how to document what the voltage and frequency was when they hit that sweet spot. And so every time they try to create a device, it's a bunch of guessing for months, sometimes years, because they're not following a very rigorous scientific method, or they don't have the right equipment. What do I mean by right equipment? It is not a trivial thing to be doing things with very high voltages and very high frequencies, because you can't buy that from a normal Kawasaki analyzer or even your testing equipment. That's custom stuff. And so to be able to do this properly, if it is something that requires that, you know, if the person hasn't been able to document it and then do a second version of it based on documentation, it may be that they just accidentally stumbled across an effect, but they don't know, honestly, what they did. And I know such a scientist in Canada who will admit this. He did have the effect. It actually was something that lifted, but he had no idea exactly what he did. And no one since has been able to reproduce it. So again, the sine qua non of science, independent in testing and verification, and independent, transparent reproducibility, at least once, if not 2 or 3 times. So that's the requirement for this STAR Challenge and Award. I'm hoping someone steps up to the challenge and gets the award. I mean, the $100,000 is sitting there in the bank, so come take it. But it's going to have to meet this criteria. It cannot be snake oil, and it cannot be secret, and it has to be open source. We do not want to talk to anyone, let me be very clear, who wants this secret, patented, or in any way an intellectual property issue. It is our intent to do this as an open source, then there's some open source software, Linux, or I don't know what it is. I'm not a software guy. I'm just a doctor from Virginia. But the truth of this is, if the person is out there, or if some of these open source things that have just surfaced in the last year on the internet are legitimate, and they really do only cost $5,000 to $7,000 for someone to make it, then they can get a pretty nice return for their trouble. There's a certain problem and a certain value to notoriety or contacts. So the nice thing about our network, it's now very large. I can easily reach pretty much any world leader in the world with something that would be legitimate. There are, as you may have gotten from my comments, a number of very high net worth people who don't want to do this until it's a chicken egg. They don't want to get involved until they see there's something working, but we don't have something working until someone gets us something. And it's this chicken egg thing. So, and these are not people who are just, wanting to be first to be second. They're sincere people, but they say, I got to see something that can be independently tested and verified. It cannot be hearsay on YouTube. So we have built this massive network that is very substantial for the last 20 years, and it would be immediately activated. The other thing that would be immediately activated, and I want to talk about our strip, because it's like, what's the day after you get something that's confirmed? Well, first of all, it's going to be all over the internet. The reports, just like we did for the Atacama humanoid, from Dr. Lockman and the people at Stanford, are going to be on the internet. If you can read the report. So it'll be a prestigious, universities and academics who will have tested it and said, this is what it is. They may say, we don't know where the energy is coming from, because if they were trained in classic or even quantum physics, they're not going to know a whole lot about the zero-point energy field and quantum vacuum and all this. But they can verify the energy input and output, that there are no tricks, and the lab will be able to say, from these plans, we were able to reproduce it. Now, we have many, many contacts who can do that part of it, but that would have to be released to the public in a very large national press club or similar event, but where you would have the provenance, the device there, you would have the testing reports there blown up, and you would have the pedigree for who the people were who reproduced it and tested it. Because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So one of the few things I agree with Carl Sagan on. And I think in this case, that's what you have to do, but it has to be a massive release to the public very quickly. Because here's the other thing that people working, like the group that took the Stan Meyer materials, they do not understand that time is your enemy. All right, the longer you perseverate and sit on something like this with the public not knowing, the riskier it is. It's very dangerous. So you would want to get, you don't want to jump the gun and say you have something when you don't. On the other hand, at the instant you're certain, and I mean 100% certain scientifically, you want to do a massive. Now that would require a funding, because just to do the PR and the public education on this would run probably into the $2 or $3 million. But I think that's less. That won't be so difficult once we have something operational. I'll just say. A foundation I recently met with, the head of that foundation wants to help us, and he's raised for his foundation several $100 million in the last few years. And so there are a lot of people watching what we're doing who are interested, but they're wanting, it's sort of like that old commercial, where's the beef? They're wanting to see something. And I've been in the trenches looking for that, where that really is. And our story of this has been both very, very promising, because I've seen things that actually do work, but then also incredibly disappointing to see how they disappear and get suppressed. One of the reasons we do not want to fund any of these sort of inventors and scientists, even ones that had the bona fides of this gentleman down at the Huntsville Space Flight Center and the Redstone Arsenal, is because if they're a lone wolf doing this somewhere, no one knows who they are because they're an obscure person. That obscurity is dangerous. Obscurity is dangerous. And this harkens back to, how my life has been ruined by being a public person on all this, where if I walk into a Whole Foods, people know who I am. Many times will come up, which is fine, and I don't find it at all flattering. It's more often annoying than anything. But the fact is that millions of people are following what we're doing. When the film Sirius came out, the Huffington Post had it was the biggest story for almost a week on the Huffington Post. Millions and millions and millions of people reading about it. So we have a certain reach that a small inventor can't have. And what I want to do is say, if you can bring us the payload, we'll launch it. So we're the launch, and we'll disclose it. And I don't care if someone threatens my life or offers me $2 billion. An intelligence director had, back in 1992, offered me $2 billion personally, and then went to my wife and tried to convince her to convince me to shut down what I was doing. I said, I don't care about $2 billion. So you cannot be bought, and you cannot be afraid. And I guess because I had a near-death experience when I was young, I'm not afraid of death. And so you just have to go. Now, one of the things that was interesting after we were in New York this past week, as I mentioned, we were at dinner meeting with a number of people, some very, very high net worth people, and we were talking about this. And someone said, well, what's the guarantee that if you had your own lab, you could just do? I said, a guarantee? I think, go ask my great, great, great whatever grandfather, who was called as one of the first prisoner of war with the British during the American Revolution, what the guarantee was that little experiment called the American Revolution would have worked. I mean, if we are all so averse to risk that we're not willing to do something this important for the world, for our children and our children's children, and for Gaia, which is a living, breathing being, then who are we? What are we as a people? I mean, if there was that level a lack of courage and this sort of putting your finger in the wind and seeing what the safe path is, there would have never been the American Revolution. All of us would be goose-stepping to Adolf Hitler's great-grandson, et cetera, and so on. So at a certain point, we have got the events, the courage to do this. But we have to put that around something. Now, I'm willing to do that part of it, as are a number of wonderful people I've been working with for many years, some of whom are not known in the public and frankly don't need to be known in the public. In fact, they'll say, you do that. But I think that that's why if we as a people come together and say, how can we support this? So that's one pathway to disclosing a device. Here's a challenge, here's the criteria, here's the award. There's another one, and that was the impetus for the film Sirius. Now, the film Sirius, as you all know, has been phenomenal. It was the largest crowdfunded documentary in history, period, to this day. It has been seen by millions of people in the world, but most of the people who've seen it have seen it on pirated sites for free. The intent of the film was that it would become sort of a rallying call for the public to provide the donation so that we could open out near the University of Virginia, where we live, in a wonderful area where there are a lot of talent, a research and development lab, the budget of which is on the website, seriousdisclosure.com. It's about $6.4 million, which most VC people, venture capital people, when they hear that number, they go, are you crazy to open a whole lab with all this high-tech stuff and 18 people? I said, well, it's only for a 2-year period. That's just the budget. I am highly confident that if we had that budget and that funding, we would be there, because I'm sitting on, just let's say, some intellectual property given to me by a brilliant engineer who was being recruited by the CIA, and part of their recruitment was to let him go into secret files and copy things to study, which he kept and which he's now given to me. It's thousands of pages of amazing stuff. But again, it's pages two-dimensional. You got to build it up. And for that, you need a team. And for that, you need funding. Now, we have only raised maybe less than $250,000 out of the $6.4 million for the Energy Lab. And you can go to our website, and there's a little ticker we change every month or two. And that's mainly because most people think someone else is going to do this. To the people who have contributed, who are in this room, thank you very much. But you cannot open a research facility for that. The equipment list runs to $500,000, and that is really pared down. So we don't even have half of what the equipment would be, never mind the building, 18 personnel with payroll, benefits, everything. Because these brilliant engineers and scientists that I've met, they're not going to leave their day jobs where they're making $150,000 a year, $200,000 a year as an engineer with benefits to work for free, because they have a family, they have kids in college. I mean, let's live in the real world for a nanosecond. You know, you have got to have the ability. I was crazy enough to leave my profession, and I have personally foregone around $8 million in income to do what I'm doing. And I have the most amazing wife ever that has been supportive of me doing this, because she understands what's at stake. But most families would not put up with that. And most people wouldn't do it. And you can't expect them to. So we have to be compassionate about the fact that people have basic needs to live. I mean, no one needs to get rich off this. We want to do it and put it out open source, but they have to have food on the table, and if their kids are in college and what have you, they have to have health care and blah, blah, blah. And then you have to have some degree of technology support, project management, and tactical security. Everybody know the difference between tactical and strategic security. Tactical means you got cameras there, it's streamed on YouTube, you have certain secure areas so that people can't come in and just sabotage what you're doing and change a circuit. Okay, so you have to have security. Strategic security is what we already have, that we built over the last 20 years, and that is all of you guys, the public, and all the people who are in the public but are in high positions waiting for something to happen, who are all the guys and women and agencies who are saying, we want to be first to be second. We don't want to be first to be first, because this is too disruptive. It's too controversial. And you know what? If you study the history of the world, the big changes that have happened have never come from the centers of power. right? Whether it was Rome or now the United States, the Pax Americana, it's never coming from your sort of hidebound academic, corporate, and governmental centers of power. It always comes from out here. Somebody in their basement inventing something like Stephen Jobs did, or what have you. So this is something that I think similarly, but it has a unique challenge that a normal technology doesn't face. And that is, if you come up with a better computer, Hewlett-Packard may not like you, or even Apple may not like you, but it will come out there. There's no prevailing national security problem with that until you get to the uber supercomputers, which NSA are working on. But if you do something like this that changes the entire way the world operates, and the need for even a petrodollar, and the need for oil and gas and coal and utilities and nuclear power, it is such a huge change. I'm going to say something here that people may take as hyperbole, but it is not. If you were to add up every technological development from the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s to now, and added it all up, the internal combustion engine, cars, planes, trains, jets, rockets, the internet, integrated circuits, biotechnology, medical, everything. This one area of physics, science, and technology, absolutely, in terms of its economic effect, its change in the way the world will operate, eclipses all of them in their aggregate. So 150 years of industrial development, this one area will be larger, which is needed. Now, people say, well, that's kind of very futuristic. I'm going, no, it's back to the future, because we should have had these technologies beginning to be developed and released 100 years ago, except there were cartels like Standard Oil and JP Morgan and other folks who didn't want it out then, and there are other cartels that don't want it out now. The people who have a stake aren't all in that camp, but they also don't want to step out in front of this freight train. Some people have asked me, aren't there some people, there was a man who was, and again, the reason I don't want to name names, it's like Eleanor Roosevelt said, I'm going to paraphrase, great minds discuss ideas, mediocre minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people, which is really true. Unfortunately, we've become very tabloid, internet tabloid, and people want to just gossip. So I don't like doing that. But there was a man who, back in, after the Disclosure Project, National Press Club, a few years later, had been watching what we were doing, and he was a billionaire and has a place out in Virginia. And he sometimes would let us use he had 5 private jets, so you could go here and there, and it was fun. But he lived on 1,500 acres and had this house that looked like a UFO with bulletproof glass, and then had a mountain that he had leveled off so one of his small jets could land there, and a helipad. And then his wife had the antebellum mansion on the other part of the estate. Very interesting guy. And he actually had his son the day after Thanksgiving one year land his helicopter in my meadow to pick up a grocery bag like you'd get from Kroger of disclosure videos and material to take back to his father. And my mother was going, Stephen, what are you doing? Is what you're doing dangerous? Why is this man landing? My poor mother. Anyway, so welcome to my world. It has not been, I think of my children, couldn't have been easy being raised this way. So, it's Thanksgiving dinner, wonderful, the day after, and here's this guy's landing a high altitude helicopter in our meadow. But the scion of this family, very interested in all this. So he eventually invites me out to his estate, and we meet. And, he has pictures of himself with Ronald Reagan and all these people from all over the world. And I'm going, oh, cool. So he was very nice. He made a $100,000 donation to Disclosure Project so we could publish and move out the briefing materials into the disclosure book and all that stuff, and get it at a very inexpensive cost during that period out to as many people as we could, kind of subsidized. And I said, well, that's great. Thank you very much. I said, well, what we really want to work on right now the next phase of disclosure, because we've done the thing with all the witnesses and stuff, and there were 800 million people, by the way, around the world saw that. Let's do the next phase and bring out the technology. He says, oh no. And this guy's 85 years old. And I said, look, you know, I mean, come on, you're in your 80s. Let's take a chance on this. He says, no, it's too dangerous. Now, this is a guy who, out the tailpipe of his Gulf Streams, and he had 5 jets, could have funded this entire energy research lab, no problem. I mean, it's this unbelievable amount of wealth. But he says, no, I mean, back in the late 60s, I knew the head of General Motors, because this man was an industrialist. And I said, yeah, so, and we're having lunch at his home at this flying saucer house. It's hilarious. And I said, well, what did you learn? He says, I learned that GM already had these technologies, that they were on a black shelf, but that this executive felt that it was time to end the secrecy on it, and so that every GM car coming off the conveyor belt would be electric, but not have to be plugged in. A true electric car, like what Tesla ought to have. And 2 weeks later, this executive was found dead of an apparent suicide. And he said, every single one of us knew that this man was not suicidal. But he was doing this from within GM and in a clandestine, in a way that was very quiet, and he was making too much noise, and he's dead. Now I said, well, can you prove that he was killed by some dark elements? He says, no, but everyone knew that's what happened. And I said, for that reason, I'm not willing to help. I said, what if you move the money through an offshore entity? No, they'll know where the money came from. Because they would. They'd absolutely know instantly. And he says, well, what are you afraid for your own safety? He says, oh, I don't care. I'll be dead in a couple years. Here's his old curmudgeon. Fantastic. He says, but I have my children and my grandchildren fly around on my planes. And there could be a malfunction. He says, I'm not willing to do that. How many billionaires like that have I met with? More than a dozen. Every time it's a similar line. It's either, I don't want to get involved in this, something this controversial, or I'm afraid something could happen to my interest or whoever, or, so the ones who know how the national security superstate works, which is ruthless, rogue, and criminal, don't want to step in, touch this third rail and get zapped. The ones who don't know are just sort of, if they don't know about that, then what their concern is that their peerage will be upset with them. What do I mean by peerage? People that they work with who would be adversely affected by such a disclosure of a technology like this. I remember being at Lawrence Rockefeller's ranch out in the Tetons, the JY Ranch, which, those of you who don't know, the Rockefeller family gave the whole Grand Teton National Park to the U.S. government, but they kept out a really beautiful ranch there at the base of Teton Peak. And he had me out there with a group of other people back some years ago, and before he passed away. And Lawrence, David Rockefeller, Chase Manhattan Bank, was the one wanting disclosure. David did not. David was the big banker guy, petrodollar, boom, no, hell no. One night I was out under the stars with Lawrence and everyone else. They sort of, he wanted some FaceTime just with me. And we were out under the stars, beautiful, crystal clear, with one of the original Remington statues of a Native American on a horseback looking up at the stars like this. Beautiful. And Lawrence turned to me, he says, we really need you to get this done. I'm working full-time as an emergency doctor, taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and 4 children and a golden retriever and blah, a normal life, mostly at that point. I use the word normal very broadly. I think normalcy is greatly overrated. But anyway, so, and I said, well, I need your help. He says, well, I can do things behind the scenes, but I'm not going to do anything. I said, are you afraid for yourself? He says, oh no. He says, but there are members of my family already raising hell with me that I'm even doing this much. Because as you know from the Project Starlight documents that I started that were the AP, the Associated Press sued the Clinton Library. He was hosting the President and First Lady there, the best available evidence and all this was being presented. There were a lot of discussions going on during the Clinton years. So he said, no, I mean, I have family members who are really, really upset that I'm doing this much. So blood is thicker than water. So in that case, he didn't want to, he wanted to keep the peace in the family. So there are all kinds of reasons why various people that we've been able to meet with, what we have got to do, we either need to find a way that the public will really support the funding, which is so far, as I said, is about 4% of what we need, or we have to find maybe a dozen people who can put in $500,000 or $600,000 each. So we need someone to head up that, because I don't know anything about fundraising. I mean, I'm a doctor. So that's just not my wheelhouse. Or we need to have someone bring us a technology that's operational, that can be open source, which is why we're launching this STAR Challenge and Award. And I'm hopeful that while we tried that many years ago, 10 years later, perhaps there are people out there who really are ready to come forward with something open source, or if there is something open source on the internet, as is being claimed, someone builds it up and can get it to us so we can move it out. Why is that important? Why isn't just having it on YouTube enough? How are you going to stand up a whole new industry? This is not just like some, like a 16-year-old can do an app and put it on the internet and become a centimillionaire. Great. This, you actually have to build something, because it's actually tangible. It's not virtual. So how are you going to get to the poor of the world, for their villages and homes, this type of generator? Someone has to build them. Someone is going to have to build the thing that's going to replace the engine in your car. Someone's going to, and it ain't going to be General Motors. Someone's going to have to build the thing that's going to replace your heat pumps at your house, so that those are just a generator system that runs your house off the grid. Someone is going to have, and that is a heavy industry that is going to have to be, I hate to use the word, capitalized. And the cap on this, it's huge. It's like the Marshall Plan that we had for Europe, to rebuild Europe. This is like the Marshall Plan for the whole planet. And we're in an emergency. So we're going to, once we get to this first stage, then we're going to have to recruit stakeholders and people who really do want to see this change. Because once the genie's out of the bottle, I think that'll happen. What the indications I got at this meeting I was at with these 120 leaders from various sectors from around the world was that there's a certain number of people who, once this is out and inevitable, they're happy to be first to be second, and they'll jump on. So we need to create that initial push. And that's what we're asking people to help us do. One of the documents that I put in this brief, this is the initial briefing we put together for President Obama shortly after he got into office. And I keep it here at this building for reasons of briefing. It's not the only copy, don't worry. But in it, one of the documents that I was very key to emphasize was the 1951 document from Canada, from Wilbur Smith, a top secret document that got accidentally declassified that states that this is the most sensitive issue in the history of the United States. It is the most secret. That there's a team headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the guy who was the czar over the whole Manhattan Project, that Edward Teller and Oppenheimer, but if you look him up in history, Vannevar Bush was one of the key people who was, and that team headed up the study of these so-called flying saucers, as they were called back, how quaintly, in 1950 when that document came out. And the secrecy around that was so great that in this memo it states not only do these flying saucers exist, and there's a group studying the modus operandi, I'm quoting, the method of action and technology behind them, but that it was more secret than the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now remember, the H-bomb, everybody know the difference between an atomic bomb and a nuclear bomb? Most people don't. An atomic bomb is fissile material. Okay, so what we unfortunately dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a very in a sense, low yield fission reaction where you split the atom. A thermonuclear bomb has that within it, and then it goes to a fusion, like the sun reaction, and is 100,000 times more powerful. And so the H bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which are what is the standard use today in the world, at least by America and others, is a thermonuclear fusion bomb, uncontrolled, which is much more powerful than an atomic bomb. Most people have no idea the difference between atomic and, I mean, these get conflated, but I want to be clear. I mean, there was no reason for us not to be educated in 2014. And so we'll have questions later at the last hour, because it's not mic'd. So what you have to understand is that that was the ultimate doomsday weapon, the hydrogen bomb. And this memo, which has never been contested, states that the project's dealing with the modus operandi, the technologies of these UFOs, was a bigger secret in the United States than the hydrogen bomb. So if you just think about the implications of that for a moment, then you begin to realize what kind of things would be done to keep this genie in the bottle, and has been done. Now, did it start in the 40s, 50s? No. T. Townsend Brown, many of you know of the RAND Corporation. He became someone who was a key figure in the development of the RAND Corporation. T. Townsend Brown, and all this information is at SeriousDisclosure.com. If you click on the energy button and go to all the links, there are documents, there's all this. That he was the man who figured out that if you put a certain type of high voltage resonant field using crystalline structures, that you would get lift. And actually, the crystals would begin to look like they were expanding, and did expand, take up more space. Amazing. And they would cause a lifting effect. That was in the late 1920s. The Kautsky-Frost experiment that was then done in 1928 or 29 in Germany reproduced that, but did even more work on it. So it isn't as if this all started after Roswell or something. There were classified projects looking into this effect of very high voltage systems, lift effect, mass cancellation. So if something becomes massless, anybody know your physics equations? Velocity is equal to, but it's inversely proportional to the mass. So go run your equation, and when mass disappears, theoretically, velocity can go to infinity. But what actually happens when it becomes massless and a massless particle, boom, it's actually in another dimension. So this is why you can get these objects. If you look at our radar tapes, if you look at the Disclosure Project witnesses at SeriousDisclosure.com, thanks to the work of some folks who worked with me for the last 15 or 20 years, we have several dozen of these people up there. And one of them, John Callahan, was doing the case with the airline, Japan Airlines in Alaska in the early 80s. And, you know, he was flying along on the polar route, 747, and this massive UFO, extraterrestrial vehicle, actually is what they're called, ETVs, it's what they're called in NSA, National Security Agency, appeared, and it was the size of a destroyer or larger on the ocean, but it was up in the air. And with one radar sweep, it would then be 180 degrees the other way, moving completely non-linearly, or in ways that were inexplicable to anyone flying a jet, all right, or a rocket. So that radar tape, we have the original for, because this chief of the investigation unit for the FAA took it with him when he retired and gave it to the Disclosure Project. So it's in my vault. You get the sense of this then, that anyone who's gotten close to the subject knows that we're not dealing with your granddad's Oldsmobile or jet or rocket. And that is the crux of the problem, is that it is such a big leap in technology from where we are now that a lot of people say, it's great, but it's too disruptive. And as the man at the University Club told me, no one who gets into a powerful position in government wants to have to deal with that much change. It's just too much change to deal with. Now, unfortunately, it would have been a manageable change between 1910 and 1930, but we missed that window. And I wasn't alive then anyway, so I couldn't have helped you out. Neither was anyone else in this room, I suspect, unless you've aged very well. You're not 100 years old. So the question becomes, why hasn't someone, if these technologies are real, done something with it? Well, they have. And it turns out, if you look at the history of this, T. Townsend Brown started out in the open world and then got pulled in by the military with his anti-gravity work that then got pulled into the RAND Corporation. We have people like Stan Meyer. And you've heard this, people think, is it an urban myth or not that Mr. Meyer had a car running on water that had one of these electrolyzers that would take water dissociated into hydrogen and oxygen and run it in real time without a fuel cell, without storing it? Yes, he did. Unfortunately, he falsified all his patents, which vitiated their legal viability because he didn't want anyone to know his little secret. And then he died mysteriously after he was meeting with some people from NATO. Ran out of a Cracker Barrel in somewhere, I think, in Tennessee, and collapsed in the parking lot saying, "I've been poisoned, I've been poisoned, I've been poisoned." Now, my team has met with his twin brother, who actually did the circuits for him in the 80s and 90s. And this is a very doable, reproducible experiment if we had a laboratory, which is what we've been calling for the funding to do. But what Stan Meyer did, and this is something I'm going to go into, what have been the mistakes? How can we learn from the mistakes I've made in the last 15 years, but the mistakes others have made in the last 24. So if I were to drop dead tonight, one of the reasons I'm making this film is I'd like for people to know, have the benefit of what I've gone through and what I've learned, because it is not obvious. It is very counterintuitive. Like most inventors, and I've never had this mindset, Stan Meyer felt that, well, he can monetize this by keeping it, the little secret formula, putting a patent into the patent office, but not putting all the detail in so no one else could really reproduce it. But of course, if you can't reproduce a technology from the patent is useless, as you know, and you can talk to any patent attorney. That's the whole point of a patent, is to protect it. Otherwise, you keep it a trade secret, like the secret ingredients of Coca-Cola. And what happened is that he died before he could really find a way to move it out, because about the time his little invention became known, where even wastewater could be used to run your house or car through a generator, just burning hydrogen and oxygen gas, which has zero pollution because you have water vapor as the tailpipe, which you can actually put back into the system and keep using it, the water. You're just pulling out the energy equivalent of the bonds, the atomic bonds, and the way that you're breaking them at very low power is what I'm going to keep referring to as this magic sweet spot. High voltage and very specific resonant frequencies depending on the substrate. By substrate, I mean water, crystalline material, air, magnetic coils. So you think of those as substrates, but the principle is what you need to understand. It's very high voltage, specific resonance, and we're not talking 110 or 220, thousands or millions of volts at very, very specific cycles per second, resonances, depending on the material. That opens what's called a Poynting vector into the zero-point energy field. And bounce. Then you're going to hit that sweet spot. You're going to go, quote, over unity, meaning you're getting more power out than in. But unfortunately, Stan Meyer, while he had an authentic system, and he had really, people say, how did he come across this? An accidental empirical observation, which is really the sort of the springboard of many sciences, an accidental observation by someone who's astute. And he worked at a radar plant, and he observed that under certain frequencies and voltages, water just went. It was quite an accidental observation. He went, wow, because H2O, 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, you can burn it. And when you burn it, there's no pollution. All you have is water vapor from the result of burning it. So he went, wow. So he started experimenting, and his twin brother Steve helped him eventually develop the circuits. Now, because he wanted to keep this secret, and he did not disperse in an open source way that technical information, everyone who's tried to reproduce it hasn't been able to, because they haven't, A, understood the concepts very well, and then even if they have been approached eventually and threatened. And we're going to talk about the suppression and the threats that go with this kind of technology, which is real. And when he was developing this, he eventually discovered that he could use a material that was in a magnetically charged sort of liquid in a toroid. A toroid is a donut, like looks like a, okay. And this was an electromagnetic generator. It didn't burn any so-called Brown's gas or water turning it into hydrogen and oxygen. And this object was the big secret of his portfolio that we were trying to acquire a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, those of you who followed our work. The heirs of the Stan Meyer collection wanted to sell it. And we had a few $100,000, but we didn't have millions. So we lost. And it went to a corporation that's in Michigan, which is all we need to talk about, that has been working on it since. And they are making the identical mistake that Stan Meyer made. They're doing it secretively. I was recently called in a panic by one of their funders out of the United Kingdom, who stated to me that they had gotten these systems to operate, including the toroid, which means that if you have a solid state, basically a solid state system with some magnetically charged material in it, and it'll run your house. Now that device had a national security order slapped on it. And most people, Stan Meyer never spoke of it because he was told, if you speak of this, you're violating the National Security Act, and we'll seize it, and you'll be in prison. So we knew this from someone who had worked very, very, very closely, because this man who'd worked closely with Stan Meyer said, forget the car running on water. That's nothing. Look for the toroid. So when we went there to the storage facility where all this stuff was kept, it was there. And all the binders and all the inventors' books and all the manual, everything was there. We went, oh, wow. We made appeals to the public. You know, I'm a doctor and I'm doing okay, but I'm not rich enough to just lay out several $1 million. I can't write a check like that. So we did what we could, but we lost. Now, when Stan Meyer had this, of course, he wasn't prepared to go mano a mano with the national security state because he was afraid. I mean, they made it very clear. You're going to prison, and that's that, or worse. At a certain point, after he passed away, that all this stuff, as I said, went into storage. So from 1996 to 2009, whenever it was, a few years ago, it was just sort of, nobody knew what happened to it. Then it surfaced. And we were really trying to do it. The tragedy of today is that in the last month or so, I got this phone call. And I had predicted at the time that that collection disappeared. I said, if it's going to be handled the way these people are stating they're going to handle it, which is to do it secretively, trying to corporatize, monetize, and privatize this technology, first of all, it's going to take them several years to get it operational because these were traditional engineers who didn't understand the physics. So you've got to get the right physicists and engineers on your team. And folks like myself who've seen these things in labs. We'll talk about this. I've been to classified labs where I've seen them operating. The second thing is that you have got to do it, cameras rolling, streamed on Ustream. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Would Silicon Valley ever buy into this, or Microsoft or Google or Apple? No, because everything's about patents and secrecy and getting over on your competitor. But if you play that secrecy game, guess who's going to be watching everything you're doing in real time, keystroke by keystroke on every computer in your lab? The National Security Agency and the National Security State. The instant you hit the eureka moment, they're coming in with an NSO, a National Security Order, and you're shut down. That's what happens. And unfortunately, that is what has now happened to this group out of Michigan, where they are being threatened and they are trying to relocate their entire lab to a friendly country. So I talked to this man out of the United Kingdom, I won't say what his name is, who's been helping fund it, I mean millions of dollars. And I said, look, there are no friendly countries. You put this in the Amazon jungle, there's a E-Systems Raytheon facility there with security people who will come in. Where are you going to go on this planet that's beyond the reach of the, what I call transnational superstate of security? Because it is transnational. So there's this naivete, and I'm speaking now to all you inventors out there and all you people who live in the world of inventions and patents and secrecy. There's no place you can hide, and there's no place you can run. Believe me. Please believe me when I tell you this. And therefore, you must do it openly with the whole world watching. Good phrase from the 60s, the whole world's watching. Now, 10 years ago, you couldn't have done that. There wasn't Ustream and Yahoo and whatever, YouTube and all this stuff. Now there is. So not the bathrooms of the lab, but all the workstations of the lab, real-time streamed on the internet. And invite people to see it. Someone comes in with a national security order, you caught them red-handed. And then I'm on every network I can get on, and I've been on almost every network in the world saying, the technologies that would save the environment, get us off oil, are being ruthlessly suppressed by a rogue group of people who are not being supervised by the President and the Congress, and without the consent of the people. This is an illegal act, and we need people to help us. Democracy. As you know, we've just launched this ET Contact app, which is fun. It's kind of more of a website than an app. It's a basic app. But basically, if you don't have it, you can go to etcontactnetwork.com and download it and put it on your smartphone, Android or iPhone. And it will you will register, and then you will come up, and you'll see who else is in your area. People have been asking for this for 10 years. How do I get hold of someone who wants to do the close encounters of the fifth kind contact protocols in Iowa? And we don't have any, by the way, we have no office or personnel. Like I said, my wife and I and some volunteers are doing all this. We don't have an office. We don't have a secretary. We don't have anything. Everything's done. So there's this wonderful volunteer who did this app for us. I met him at a retreat training to make contact up in Arizona 6 months ago. He says, oh, I'll do this for you. So he just volunteered his time to do it. He's a very busy tech guy. And so we've launched that. There are going to be more features coming. But the nice thing about spreading the word for that is that anyone who wants to be involved in the CE5 contact work in a local area, or if you travel, you can move the map and zoom into that. Say you're going to LA. And you can say, oh, I'm in the area. You guys, anybody there going to do anything? Or if you want to support just education, you may want to just get together with people and host a screening of, an educational screening of Sirius in your community. Or you may want to do something to get together with people who want to work on general disclosure issues and educate your community. Or you may want to find some people who are interested in these technology and free energy aspects of this that you can network with in your local community. You can use it for all those purposes. It isn't just for the CE5 initiative. But that's what it was initially conceived as, because we had so many team members from all over the world. And what was awesome was that the night we launched it at like 1 in the morning. I hit the button. And within hours, every single continent was lit up with little CSETI logo triangles. It was so much fun to watch. And, and now it's literally every continent, almost every country where there are people. So it's very, very exciting. So that's a great way for people to plug in to each other. And there is some confusion about that app versus what's called the ET Contact Tool, which is on SeriousDisclosure.com. That is actually a whole training program that goes through the protocols of remote viewing, meditation, the techniques of the CE5 initiative. It actually will take your smartphone and turn it into a magnetometer that will pick up magnetic field changes if a craft is near you, even if it's not visible. It may be transdimensional and translucent, but it'll set that off. All kinds of cool features, and that is something that is separate. That's more of a training and educational tool. This networking app, the etcontactnetwork.com, is purely so people can contact each other. That's all it does. Eventually, we may be able to get it to so where people can actually have chat or IMing in it, and there are all kinds of features that it doesn't have that many people want it to have. And I said, well, this was one man with his volunteer efforts while he's running his own business doing this. So, I mean, this is, again, yeah, please understand that everything we do, from the Disclosure Project National Press Club event, all the books, the film Sirius, except for the production company, everyone involved with that were volunteers, work for free. So we don't have any paid staff, and we don't have, so when we get something like this, it's because someone said, I'll do it for you, which is great. The man is, he wants to remain anonymous, but he's just an amazing person.
Why was your strategy to choose to offer Earth people money? Because it seems like at any point they could get slapped with a national security order. I mean, seriously, could you try to contact the advanced civilizations for that technology?
Yeah, everyone thinks the ETs are going to land and give us one of these devices. Number one, that technology would be so many thousands of years advanced from where we are, no one would figure it out. You'd have to do a multi-billion-dollar reverse engineering study. Number two, that's not why they're here. They, in other words, everyone always asks, and I get this asked by people in politics, well, if they're here, why don't they just land on the White House lawn and force the issue? I said, because they're wiser than that. They know that unless we as a people learn through the steps of first stop lying to each other, bring out the truth, do this ourselves, there's no learning curve. So if it was imposed externally, that would be about as efficacious as us trying to impose Jeffersonian democracy on the warlords of Afghanistan. So that is not a solution, and they are too wise to know that. Thirdly, if there was something that was as overt as that, begging the question whether you could make Haydn tell us what it is, and we bypass this process of coming together to do it, I think we're going to lose a big lesson of what it means to come together as human community to do something. And I don't think that's trivial. I mean, I think that it's like if you had a child and every time it stumbled, you caught it so it never learned to walk. And you infantilized it to the point of it never standing on its own. These civilizations, I personally believe, and there's a lot of ancient evidence for this, have been around thousands, millions of years. And I think that they're watching us evolve in fits and starts into something resembling a world civilization, but that we've made some mistakes in the last number of decades, and we've gone off track. We need to get back on track. But if they did something overt to correct that for us, there would be no teachable moment then. Moreover, what's even worse is that the intelligence community would love for such an event to happen, because they would instantly say, see, we're being invaded by aliens. Give us another $2 trillion for Star Wars. So I think that we have to, if I've figured that out, I'm sure these civilizations have. I think they're really looking for us to come together, find our own resources, and make this change happen. Now, can there be inspiration, guidance that people have had? Sure. I know people who worked in classified projects that have had some amazing contact experiences. Based on that, we're able to get exactly what needed, one of these devices to be operational. Actually, the man that we were contracted with 4 years ago. But I think that in terms of it being more overt than that, it needs to come through humans. We're the children of Earth. We're responsible for this planet. And I think the only way we would see a larger intervention is under certain worst-case scenarios, which we don't need to go into, but really cataclysmic, biosphere or something like that, collapse. And I think short of that, it's incumbent on us to educate each other and come together as community and make this happen. And in that process, that in and of itself is edifying and evolutionary. And taking a shortcut around that, I think, is potentially deleterious to our evolution as a species, no matter how attractive that might look.
You mentioned Edgar Mitchell. Are there other organizations who are willing to collaborate with you, such as the Institute of Noetic Sciences, to support sort of this whole thing through coming through the avenue of deepening consciousness individually, you know, and building upon that to become a more whole society?
Oh yeah, we've done things at their headquarters, and I did a briefing for their board. In fact, Senator Claiborne Pell, those of you who were poor like me who went to college on Pell Grants, and thank him, was there. I thanked him, actually. I said, I wouldn't have gone, thank you. I was raised very, very poor. We have, and there's a lot of support in those quarters, yes. And so there are many organizations that are supportive and interested in this entire subject, and many of them have gone on to become these ambassadors to the universe and learn. And we did just a one-day program at their retreat there in near Petaluma. You know where it is. It's a nice facility there north of the San Francisco Bay Area. And so yes, there are wonderful groups like that we're collaborating with and that I've done trainings for. Well, you know, in the work she's asked about contact with the Atacama humanoid origins. In our work, when we go out into the stars, we do a lot of work with remote viewing consciousness and intuitive remote viewing. I don't have one of the CIA's electronic systems, but we don't need it. You can learn to meditate and do that naturally with practice. But we have had experiences where more than one person have seen, now whether it's exactly the species of the Atacama humanoid, very much similar, very tiny, where the adults are only like a foot, 14 inches tall. Now all of you know that the Atacama humanoid has been certified by the world's expert on dysplasias and skeletal abnormalities to be about a 6 to 8 year old equivalent. I mean, because of the growth plates of the long bones, not just the legs, but all over the body. And he's recently reasserted that. And this is Dr. Ralph Lockman at Stanford. And so the question is whether that particular being is of extraterrestrial origin or some mix, or of a civilization that may have been here for thousands of years, where you get these stories that you hear around the world of I was talking to a man in New York who came to my presentation about the wee people, the little ones, that have been reported in Russia and in the Caucasus and in Ireland and in Puerto Rico. So there is this, you don't know where mythology leaves off and fact and evidence. And one of the things we would like to do, and we may do this year, is a further exploration of just the Atacama mystery of what that is, because it is still a mystery. In fact, I was just corresponding with the genetics guy at Stanford a couple weeks ago, and he says more of a mystery now because they have found the area on the genome that controls for stature, height. And he says it is, and I'm quoting, the chances that it is a mutation or a random event is infinitesimally small. Now, this is a guy who heads up a lab at Stanford with 45 PhDs under him, who sent it to the top people in the world. So this thing is more of a mystery now than it was a year ago. Also, in the film series, just to correct something, at the time they thought it was a male. Now they're not even sure of its gender, or if it has a gender as we think of it. All right? So, so maybe it's androgynous, or who knows, or they don't reproduce in the same XY fashion as male-female. The point I'm making is the more we learn about it, the stranger it is, not less, which would point to something extraordinary. But we can't claim that. We don't know. And of course there's no genetic database of extraterrestrial species. Well, maybe the National Security Agency has one. I don't. But that means that the Stanford professor doesn't either. And so what he did was run when we took the clippings off the rib of this little guy, or girl, or whatever, we took the bone marrow, and he got an excellent genetic sample, ran it, just automated, computerized. It wasn't done by hand. That takes years and billions of dollars. Through the 2,500 ethnic groups that are known on the planet. And 91% matched, 9% didn't. Very large unmatched. It's 32,000 base pairs of genetic material did not match. In other words, completely unknown from a very good sample at the best 3 reference labs in the world. So that means that, now a gorilla is 98.7% identical genetically to you and me, or maybe more to me than most of you. But I'm big and I'm furry and I'm muscly, so I'm more of an ape. But the Atacama humanoid is 91. And give you some perspective, the Neanderthal, which is a totally different species from Homo sapiens, is 99.5% identical to modern Homo sapiens. So we're dealing with something here that we don't know. Now, unfortunately, the geneticist has to refer to this thing as a deformed human because he's got a career to protect, for one thing. But also, he's never going to say it's E.T. But of course, when he said that, boom, the mainstream media said, oh, mystery solved, it's a deformed human child. Well, I've delivered a lot of premature infants in what are called precipitous emergency deliveries. None of them are 6 inches tall. And that's at birth. This is 6 years old, and it's 6 inches tall. I held it. I was one of the first few people who have ever held this. And doing this procedure on it, oh my God, it's so dry and fragile. We were afraid we were going to shatter the whole thing. But ultimately, it'd be great to go to that area of the world on an expedition, but there aren't funds to do that. It'd be great if somebody just in the scientific curiosity wanted to fund it and come along, as long as they came along and didn't interfere. Because what I would love to do, I mean, it sounds terrible, but with the science part, because what would be wonderful is to be able to go there and actually set up a CE5 contact event in the area during the night, and during the day do expeditions to areas to see if we can find more of these, because there's reports that there are. Now, whether that's true or not, they're a bit apocryphal. But if there are, everyone agrees in the scientific community we're working with, if you get 2 of these, it's game over, it's dispositive, this is not a human. You would not get 2 deformed creatures identical that would be this bizarre, with 10 ribs, all the anomalies you see in the photos and the CAT scan that's on our website. So if people want to get caught up on that, if you go to seriousdisclosure.com, there's an evidence button, and there's one that's just for the Atacama humanoid, and you can catch up with that. But my own feeling is that when we've had these experiences with some of these very, very small, tiny ET civilizations, they're very interested, I believe, that we're sort of exploring the possibilities of this. And we don't know if there's a direct link between those two, or maybe this is some distant cousin. Or it may be something completely indigenous to Earth that's a humanoid that we've never known about. The Earth, the Earth holds many mysteries. And I think that we have to keep an open mind about what the possibilities are.
How do you know you won't get a national security order slapped on you?
Very good question. And this actually came up very recently when we were meeting with a group of folks in New York. And I said, maybe I will. But if it's on camera, I mean, I remember Ted Koppel of Nightline asked me this. And I said, well, I'll come on a show like yours and tear it up. But the other part of it that I didn't talk about is having millions of people know what you're doing. Because here's a bit of a keto. This group they're like vampires. They do really well in the darkness of secrecy. They do not, writ large, want to be caught in a bright billion-watt spotlight, which we have, in a sense, created around what we're doing, for better or for worse. For my privacy, it's for worse, but for other reasons, it's very good. Because if they were to do such a clownish thing, and the cameras are rolling at a lab, or it would be exposed widely. that there is a group operating off the reservation that has tried to do a national security order or made an overt threat or what have you. So I think that the public, and I say this sincerely, you all sharing the word on this and everyone on YouTube sharing this interview, the public ultimately is our shield, and it's probably why we're all still here. Because the public knowing what we're doing is protective. You know, if you go to the National Reconnaissance Office that runs all these super secret spy satellites, their headquarters, above the door it says, "We own the night." And I always say, well, we own the light. We own disclosure. So they can own the night, we'll own the light. And so if you don't agree to play on the field of secrecy, you can transcend it and go stay in the field of telling the truth and being out there. But it has to be done with lots of people coming together, and that's the beauty of what we can do now with the internet and communication systems and the app and what have you. So that is our first line of strategic defense. It's counterintuitive. And almost every technology person I know who's worked on this, and almost everyone who's wanted to do funding of this sort of energy technology, has wanted to do it secretly. Because they think they're going to outfox the national security state. I said, oh no, you're not. You think the world's going to beat a path to your door, and you're going to, be this mogul like, Steve Jobs was for Apple. No. I said, before the public beats a path to your door, Murder Incorporated is going to meet a path to your door. So you've got to do this with your eyes wide open and do it very openly. And the intellectual property, secrecy, patent route, I think is maybe later. I hope we don't have to go back to that, but for various applications. But the fundamental science and technology got to be open source. But then when it is, and it's been reproduced, and you have thousands of these devices going out, one of our plans is some of the celebrities that have followed our work, that I don't want to name, is to have their homes running on. Imagine someone on the cover of People magazine, So at a certain point, you get this out there, and you just sort of, get a fund, so you have a couple hundred of them made, and you gift them to the right people in academic institutions, celebrities, pop culture icons, rock music stars that I've met. Be pretty cool. And that's very hard. I mean, the hidebound at Harvard may not talk about it, but I suspect Steven Seagal would, or Bono of U2, right? So, you can read between the lines, and I think that's where the public coming together, but using a strategy. The strategy we have is a really complex strategy, but it's really, when it gets right down to it, very, very simple. And that is, you do it out there, fully in the open, and that way you're most protected. And to the degree you're doing anything secretively, you're at great risk. It's very counterintuitive because it's not what people normally do with science and technology.
One last observation. Everything you said is kind of needed the answer, but so the race is on because the powers that be for years have had the advantage because A, there wasn't a lot of information in the 20s to the 60s and 70s. When the information, when the internet hit, free speech became available, all of a sudden things started to happen. GMOs became more of an issue, so they're trying to keep us distracted. Sure. And we're trying to get the information going through. So at some point, how does that race play out? Because the people that want to keep the power are going to try to keep that power in all the different ways that they have to manipulate us relative to how do we keep the information flow going.
Yeah, the question that I need to repeat for the camera is, the ETs play a role in the fact that these very powerful interests that have manipulated human opinion and what have you are involved in a lot of what we call bread and circus distractions, and will at some point the extraterrestrial civilizations play a role in that kind of information and psychological warfare race. And I would say yes, and to the extent that, for example, we just got a report from someone who was a security officer where one of these objects had materialized very, very close to him. It was in Washington State or Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. And I think that a lot of times the way that the ETs have appeared have been ways that let enough people know we're not alone, but not too much to kind of hit that invisible wire that's there where people who would like to make hay an alien invasion week on the History Channel would say, hey, it's an alien invasion. So they're having to play this very carefully. But at the same time, there are so many people who have seen, like with the Phoenix Lights, and the governor finally coming clean and saying, yes, I saw it too, and it was real. This huge 2-3 foot across craft that floated over the valley. And I was there the night that happened. Some of you may know that. It was actually a CE-5. I had just done the protocols to invite them to come because we were putting together the digital images of UFOs to give to Congress a month later. And so that is actually how the Phoenix Lights happened. It happened right above us. And so it was a CE-5. And for a purpose, though. It wasn't trivial because they knew we were putting this thing together with all these members of Congress in '97. So that event happened in March. Our briefing was in April of '97 here in Washington, in Georgetown. And I asked them to do something that would advance that. Now, interesting, the news blacked out until June on it. It really wasn't covered outside the Phoenix area until June. And it got broken to the national news eventually. But then it was, of course, explained away as flares and this and that, because they always create a cover story. So after this event happened, they sent jets up that did drop flares and filmed that and say, see, that's what this was. But people who were actually up close to it, I mean, it's this massive structure that blacked out the stars as it went over, if they were right underneath it, and it was miles across. And the jets that we sent up, when they got close to it, just went back to base. I mean, they were like, right? Well, we know that from some pilots at Luke Air Force Base out there. And so I think that the ETs want to advance the knowledge that we're not alone, but they don't want to do it in a way that is intimidating. Because I think ultimately they're incredibly evolved in consciousness and very nonviolent. So they don't want to do anything that would be psychologically violent or spiritually violent. And that's why it's best if this education comes from us to each other. See what I'm saying? To answer your question. As opposed from on high down. Because that could be something that could be taken very much the wrong way. And I think that's right. People get mad. Why are they so secretive? And why don't they just land on the White House lawn? And actually, Larry King asked me that question. And I go, look, I think they're wiser than to pull a stunt like that. And also, I think that they really do think that there's something edifying about us tackling this issue, including this national security superstate that's run amok, because someone needs to rein that in. And it's unlikely to be the politicians. It's going to have to be the people. And we, the people, need to do it. Now, that takes some degree of resolve and courage, and you have to do something besides, laying on your couch, surfing through television channels, looking at late-night TV and eating Cheetos. That's part of the problem of the whole bread and circus culture that's grown up in our society in the last few decades, is that there's so many distractions and there's so much ephemera and nonsense that it's easy to keep people entertained with that and looking in another direction, while these really important issues are really not being addressed. And I think that to an extent is by design, but it's also our responsibility to take our own minds and say, we're going to pay attention to these important things. And luckily, there are millions of people are looking into all this. What I hope this next level of what we're doing, we have literally tens of thousands of people, by the way, now, around the world that have gotten the training app and for contact, and now we're getting the networking app so they can be in touch with each other, because we didn't have it until just last week. And that is happening very large, very big, sort of exponential growth in contact teams all over the world. A disclosure, as I mentioned, I think not that we've finished that task, but we've launched it, and more people believe this is real than don't. But the technology part of it, that has been the thing that's been the hardest for me over the last decade, as I went through the litany of all the kind of tricks and this and that and all the disappointments. But we have to keep doing that, because we're really at a point in our society where there aren't going to be any sort of temporary fixes that are going to work. It's great to have solar panels, and my farm in Virginia has a a big 10 kilowatt solar farm that we've generated almost 5 megawatt hours of electricity, but most people wouldn't be able to put that in. And it's great. You know, we have a Chevy Volt that you can plug in, and it can run off the solar panels, and it goes 40 miles. But you want to drive 100 miles, you're using gas. So we have these partial fixes that are coming out. We need the next level of it. And that's where we're going to need a lot of support in either fundraising or someone who can come to us and claim this challenge, an award of $100,000, which, I mean, I wish it were $100 million, but that's what we can put at stake. And if people can meet the criteria, it'd make us all a very happy group. And I think we'll let the public know the instant we have something legitimate. That's for sure. We will not sit on it. There will be nothing secret about it.
It doesn't quite resonate with me when you say that all the big petro oil and corporations would disappear. I think they would just pull it off their blank shelf.
Yes, so the question's asked, wouldn't some of these interests that already have it, that have linear systems that they can meter, like oil and gas and coal and what have you, get behind this, and if they do have it in a classified project, begin to bring it out? The answer to that is, I hope so, and probably yes. Because once it's a fait accompli, in all likelihood, they will begin to bring it out. But that's a good thing. But if the fundamental basic technology is out there, the science is out there, open source, it would be able to go through thousands of different manufacturing entities that would want to bring up iterations of it, because it wouldn't be patented. You wouldn't be infringing anything. Now, that I think would be a very wonderful development, including the fact that there may be corporate interests that would come out and say, oh yeah, well we have a better version of this, and act like they just invented it. They would never admit they had black shelved it, but that'd be fine too. The main thing is to get the ball rolling in the direction of bringing out these solutions. I don't think that the issue of overcharging for it, if it doesn't have a lot of, you know, your iPhone costs about $64 all in to make, including profits in Cupertino and staff and executives and private jets, and they sell for $700. There's a massive, massive profit margin. Same thing with all software systems, you know, 1,000%. So, but what would happen if there's no IP, there's no intellectual property, secrecy, trade secret, and patent around it, then people would be able to do iterations of it that instead of costing, you know, $10,000 for one of these generators, maybe it costs $2,000, but it's running your entire house, which is, you know, less than 1 year of your energy costs. Some homes that are using oil, or this past winter, were facing $5,000 to $10,000 oil bills and gas bills because of the severity of the winter. So I think that when you look at this, that is completely doable. And if there's not this sort of crazy secrecy or patent issue around it, the price point's going to be what it costs to manufacture, distribute, and then some overhead and what have you. My goal is that if our little operation at STAR, it's called Serious Technology Advanced Research, the acronym is STAR, is that if we were able to move this to where we actually started providing it to the public, any revenue that would come in would go into gifting it to very poor areas. For example, if you look at equatorial rainforests, many of those villages and areas are very poor. If you said this thing costs $5,000, you might as well say $5 billion. But they're chopping down the wood to make charcoal to cook. So there's a huge amount of environmental damage in areas where people would never be able to afford to buy some manufactured item. And that's where a sort of an enlightened, sort of like Newman's own salad dressing, my view of what we're doing would be like that, where we would then gift it or see that in cooperation with other international and local entities, get these technologies to areas where there's a huge amount of environmental damage. But they really couldn't afford to just purchase a system like this for their village or their energy needs. And that would be an amazing change in what's happening right now in the destruction that's going on, not by large corporations, but by subsistence farming and subsistence cooking and energy needs from just chopping down forests and what have you. So that's one of my goals if we get that far, is that, you know, to have a foundation part of what we're doing that does that, that provides these technologies to areas that can't buy them, that are in need. Because it's really about, you know, ultimately, you know, I'm an emergency doctor, and I know an emergency when I see one. And it's an act of compassion to say, okay, the world is in an emergency, but we need to do something to lift the burden not only on Gaia, but also our fellow human beings that aren't doing as well as we all are. And it's an act of compassion and to do that, and that's really what gets me up every day, is the opportunity that might happen. Yeah, the National Press Club event 13 years ago, and the things we've done since were really an accident of a situation. It's not an accident. It was required of a situation that was so dysfunctional that there was no other way out. So, you know, okay, I'm a doctor working as an emergency guy, and I'm shuttling up here to D.C. and New York, meeting with the CIA director and this person and this member of the Senate Intelligence Committee with Project Starlight, which was the predecessor name, although it was kept very quiet before the Disclosure Project. And I'm in my mid-30s. In my naivete, I thought we had a constitution and a democracy, and I thought a lot of things that were really nice lessons from your high school civics class, but are just nonsense. So when I learned that the president and the CIA director had made inquiries into this issue and had been denied any information, when I first got the letter from my point of contact to the CIA director, which I have right here, it was described to me, and I was told I would be the first person to brief the administration, the Clinton administration, and this CIA director on this subject. Now, my wife and I laughed. I mean, I'm this 35-year-old doctor, you know, or 30, I don't know, at that age point, you know, running an emergency department. I'm going, oh, this is absurd. It cannot be. So then what happens is that I come up here and I have the meeting, and there was no prevarication. It was completely true. And so then I go over and I meet with members of Congress. So I meet with, you know, people on intel, appropriations, what have you. Same story. And they were not lying. And the pièce de résistance is probably 1997, so 4 years later, and I'm briefing the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All right, this is the guy who put, you know, he's J2 for Joint Staff, head of intelligence, admiral. And it's a stand-up briefing at the Pentagon, and I go in there with my military advisor, a few disclosure witnesses that had not come public yet, and a man who walked on the moon, Edgar Mitchell. 6 men walk on the moon, and who was learning about all this, and so I invited him to come along. And I'm there with this admiral, and before I had gone to that, I had sent a document, and it's on our website. It's the NRO document, National Reconnaissance Office document, a secret document that I acquired, and I'd sent that ahead of time before I got there. And it had all the project code names and numbers and what have you. You can look at it. It's on our website for anyone to look at if you can read. None of this is secret. But he knew how to read a document. And so he contacted one of the compartments. And he was told, he told them, I want to be read into or briefed on this project. And they said, well, Admiral, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know. Let me repeat, the head of intelligence, Joint Chiefs of Staff of the largest military in the world at the Pentagon. I was there. Now, at this point, he's so mad. He says, well, God damn it, if I don't have a need to know, who does? And they said, sir, we cannot discuss this with you, and basically hung up on him. It was a corporate contractor. So by the time I get to this meeting, he is frightened and furious. And so I do a meeting. It was supposed to be a 45-minute stand-up briefing. It goes on for a couple hours. And he keeps canceling appointments downstream. And at the end of it, I said, we really need your help fixing this problem. It's a huge constitutional crisis. He says, what am I supposed to do? He says, you're telling me you briefed the CIA director and gotten stuff with the Rockefellers to the president. They are being sidelined. And not only that, but that there are technologies that we've developed that are anti-gravity that have been functioning since the 50s and 60s that can do circles around the best thing I have that I know about, which is a B-2 stealth bomber. I said, yes, sir, that's all true. He says, and then what can I do? It's point, set, match. He says, good luck, but he turned to me and he said, as far as I'm concerned, the people running this are a criminal, rogue enterprise, and you have my permission to disclose everything you have and any source you have. And I have been told that by many, many senior people. And when people say, who red-lighted or green-lighted the disclosure project, I said, it'd make you very surprised. This is going to hit the internet. But the head of intelligence joint staff, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, members of the Senate, because they're all going, we should know, but we don't. I bring in dispositive documents, testimony, evidence, whatever it is. They make an inquiry based on that actionable intelligence, and they're told nothing. That is proof of an illegal, rogue component within not our country, but multiple countries. So once we proved that, in 1998, I wrote a UNOD letter. Now, what is that? Unless otherwise directed. Now, I learned this from my military folks I'm not ever been in the military or government. And they said, here's how you do this. The way we do something when it's controversial, we send in a letter, and it's called a UNOD letter, unless otherwise directed. And we basically said, this is our assessment, and here's what we're going to do unless otherwise directed. But they don't have to reply unless otherwise directed. So we did that. In late 1990, I believe it was in 98, we sent this letter, went to the head of every agency, FBI, Department of Justice, CIA, you name it. Return receipt requested. We can prove that these went to these entities. And I said that unless otherwise directed, we're going to start disclosing the testimony of people who have top secret security clearances and oaths, as well as documents. And we were exempt from the National Security Act for prosecution, and that this is a legal action because the operation keeping this secret is illegal, rogue, a priori, is not protected under the Constitution or the rule of law. No one to this day has contested that letter in 2014. Based on that, from 98 to 2000, we put together the Disclosure Project, and the rest is history. So this is very different than, say, what Edward Snowden did. Snowden was disclosing information of this program PRISM that did have oversight from the president and the oversight committees, even though there were members of the Senate oversight committees who were appalled and shocked by it, and still are. But there was still oversight. So even though that's a black project, it was a legally overseen black project. So let me make a distinction between that and what I'm talking about. I'm talking about unacknowledged special access projects that are illegal and rogue and unconstitutional, and as such have no protection from any law that Congress has passed and a president has signed. Now that we can prove, and if someone wants to take me to court, I'm ready to go, because boy, we can prove it. And the subpoenas that would fly to the top people that we have briefed in the Congress, at the Pentagon, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, whom I personally briefed, this head of intelligence joint staff, CIA directors, they'd all be called to swear under oath. And they would have to say, yep, and we didn't know a thing. So at a certain point, there's no way around that. So we did that due diligence between 1993 and 1998. That 5-year period was all the backstory that led to us saying, we're just going to go forward now. Not without risk, and not without some people furious that we were doing it. I mean, furious. And who are still furious that we're doing it. But it was a correct thing to do. It was a patriotic thing to do. And also the right thing to do from the point of view of even the legalities. Because you cannot claim protection under national security or secrecy oaths while at the same time breaking the law and lying to the head of intelligence for the Joint Staff, or lying to the president, or lying to the CIA director, or lying to members of the Senate Intelligence Committee who are supposed to be overseeing these kind of operations. You can't have it both ways. But that's how they wanted it for 50 years. They wanted it both ways. And that's what Eisenhower learned the very, very, very hard way in between 1954 and 1961 when he left office, is that he actually got outmaneuvered by the military and the intelligence and corporate complex, and he totally lost control over these operations. He knew about them, and he was very interested in all of this, but he lost control. And no president since then has had operational access control. Now, let me make a distinction between knowledge of something and control of it. You can, I've given documents like this to people who then have gotten a certain level of access and been briefed on parts of all this information. But when they try to assert any control over it, basically it's like the admiral, they get hung up on the phone, you know. And that is an enormous problem for our country and other countries like the United Kingdom and France, Australia. And it's something that is a real threat to democracy and to the notion of what we think we live in. And so one of the myths that the public suffers under is that we live under an intact constitutional republic and democracy. The other myth is that we have a free press. I was at this meeting I mentioned with all these 120 elites and world leaders around the world. One of them was a publisher of a major paper that I can't name, and this issue came up. Because everyone who asked, who's kind of a mid-level journalist for the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or CNN will say, oh, if any of this were true, it would be in the news. I go, really? This guy said, oh, yeah. He says, I would be awakened in the wee hours of the morning or whenever as the publisher, owner and publisher of this big paper. And they would say, have so-and-so pull that story. And they would pull it. And on our website, there is a document from the CIA from 1991 that describes this policy that the CIA has, even domestically, to embed people in these various large media outfits to change, alter, stop stories that they didn't want to get out. Now, John Q. Public, going to their high school and college civics lessons, thinks we have a free press. There's another big myth. The other huge myth is that Adam Smith is alive and well, and we have a free market economy. Nonsense. We have a managed market economy. What do I mean? You can't have a free market economy if the biggest technological breakthroughs for the most important sector of the economy is being ruthlessly suppressed and is being held down through the national security state. On our website, there is a document from 3.5 years ago from the Federation of American Scientists that states there are 5,135 patents that have been seized under the National Security Act that have been sequestered. And it even talks about one that was in 1971, a highly efficient, for back then, more than 20%, maybe it was 50%, efficient photovoltaic generator, meaning sunlight going straight to electricity in a generator, that was seized under the national security provisions. Well, this is not a nuclear trigger or a weapon. It was something that would have competed with the price point of coal and gas. And so who are these bureaucrats working for? Now, do you think the president in the Oval Office knew of that action when it happened? No. Or any member of Congress? No. So you have this permanent bureaucracy that will do these things at the behest of those who are with an all-access badge. And they're not going to say no. So they just go and seize it. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's a mainstream scientific organization that did a study of these seized and sequestered patents. But the patent is only a fraction of it. The man I told you about who did this trans-dimensional technologies effort in '74, he didn't even try to go to patent. He never got that far. They found out what he was working on and showed up with a national security order, just like Stan Meyer's toroidal free energy device, before there was ever an attempt to patent it. So on top of the 5,165 patents seized, there's probably several times that number that have been intercepted prior to it even going to patent. So how then can you convince me that we live in a free market economy when the most important part of our economy and everything we use, from transportation to lights to whatever, has all been managed and controlled by people who have special interests? So this is like your giant, people talk about Washington and special interests, but this is it to the nth degree. So that's sort of how we ended up coming around to this, because we realized that the future of the planet and our democracy were really being jeopardized, and that we were on the right side of the law. Now, if I had jumped straight from identifying people who knew this in documents and testimony, but had not offered it to the president and to these oversight committees and to these agencies, then I would have been guilty of doing something potentially illegal. And that's why I was actually very careful. I was very much dotting my I's and crossing my T's, because my advisor said, you've got a tiger by the tail, you better be very careful with this, which we were. I mean, it was a very big effort that nobody knows about, well, till now, people see this, but that's how we did it, why we did it. We had to be careful. But now at this point, I said that toothpaste has been squeezed out of the tube, and notwithstanding the corruption that happens between the intelligence community and the big corporate media with the internet, when we launched the National Press Club event, somewhere upwards of 800 million people heard about it. So it's very, very, very difficult, and if you look at it, more than half the population believe UFOs are real, and part of the government's hiding part of it. Now, they don't know the details, but more than half, more than who voted for any president in our lifetime. And 43% of Americans now think that we are currently being visited by advanced civilization. Very big number in a poll that came out last year. So I tell people we've really, from that point of view, but in terms of the conventional wisdom of the hidebound elites, the inbred hidebound elites that are running the corporate media and academia and big government, that is the conventional wisdom there is that, oh, pshaw, this can't be true. Because if it were true, I would know about it. That's what I hear over and over and over again. There's a certain hubris, because I have a lot of family that are tied into the Ivy League schools and the elite institutions. And the mindset is, if this were true, I would know about it. And yet I have a sister-in-law who had been at one point the editor of the Boston Globe. And when I was first getting involved with this, she says, I don't care if you put a dead ET on my desk. The Boston Globe will never run a story about this, because that's the domain of the tabloids and silly season, and we're a blue chip paper in Boston. And this is a family member. Because of the ridicule. And the thing that most people don't understand, and I was told this by an Air Force major years ago, most of the secrecy at this point isn't maintained by any kind of cloak and dagger threats. It's because the subject is so ridiculous. It has been portrayed as the domain of the kooks and the tinfoil hat people, and the sky is falling, and I've been abducted to another planet, and what have you, that people who are, quote, respectable in academia, government, the media, don't want any association with it. Where did that start? I have a document that I got after I briefed the CIA director, and it has a stamp date 1994 when it was finally released, and it was a document from 1953, okay, 61 years ago, where the CIA is talking about using psychological warfare on the UFO subject, and, I'm quoting, engaging Disney Studios to make cartoons about the subject, so it would be trivialized and made ridiculous. Yeah, I have this document. I mean, this is a dispositive. It came from the agency to me. So with the provenance that goes with that. So we have now 61 years of a very well orchestrated counterintelligence defaming of the subject campaign. So when I started trying to do this, 20 years ago, it wasn't like we were starting at ground level trying to go up Mount Everest. We were starting at 20,000 leagues under the sea trying to go up Mount Everest, really, honestly. And that's why it's been such a heavy lift. I mean, very difficult. Hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But, you know, because it's not a level playing field. And I can sit with people who are major, but they'll say, oh, no, we can outrun with this. Now, many people say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. I go, really? Well, it's not. It's not a theory. And it's not a conspiracy. It's just the way the world works. And so disclosure happened because no one else would do it. Honestly, I never thought I would get involved with that. What I really wanted to do was bring the concepts of higher consciousness, transdimensional physics and communication systems to set up ambassadors around the world to make contact, bypassing the sort of dysfunction of the UN, State Department, governmental thing as an NGO, non-governmental organization doing that. And actually, because we were so successful so quickly, you know, in 1992, we're there on the beach in Florida, and 4 ET craft materialized right in front of everyone, 50 people, including 2 colonels and Air Force pilots. It was on the front page of the Pensacola paper that day. The video we have is, I don't operate cameras, but there was a guy who had an old Hi-8, you know, the old Hi-8 camera. So it was not very good, but you can hear him going, holy damn! You know, you probably have seen the film footage. And that's when, after that, the former head of Army intelligence, who'd been pulled into the corporate world, and a bunch of other people pulled me aside and overtly first tried to buy me off and then threatened me. And it's never stopped since. And when I refused to be bought off, they started a defamation of my character campaign, to the point that I'm working in this ER up to my, you know, eyebrows and blood and brains and everything, and they put out a thing on the internet that I'm actually not a doctor and don't have a medical degree. So I'm having to fax all over the media and everywhere my medical degree and my license. That really happened to me. And it hasn't ended since. It's been 22 years of that kind of psychological warfare. But, you know, I just, in a way, I'm used to it now. You know, nothing surprises me that these clowns would put out there. But at the same time, it really gets hard to take just because you get so irritated. You know, it's like, really? And the public is so gullible, they don't know what to believe. So it's really hard. I mean, it's very, very hard because, you know, you're going against a very big headwind. And the inventors have run into the same thing, you know, because they'll be ridiculed and laughed off the stage. And they'll have people who will appear before them who have, these are legitimate people, who will then just say, pshaw, you're violating the second law of thermodynamics. No, you're not. You know why? Because there's complete conservation of energy. It's just that what's not being accounted for is the majority of energy in the cosmos you're not factoring into your equation. So there's complete conservation of energy. You're just pulling it out of this other field of 0 point and quantum vacuum. So when people tell you that these technologies can't be done because it's violating any of these fundamental laws of physics, it's absolutely not true. But that's the argument. In fact, there was a man from MIT at this elite gathering I was at a few months ago who was telling everyone, oh no, you can't do that because you're violating the laws of thermodynamics. I'm saying, no, not any more than water falling over the Hoover Dam, turning a generator, is violating it. It's using the force of water, which is really gravity. Gravity, you're turning gravity into electricity. That's all a hydroelectric dam is. Think about it. It's the mass of water being pulled down because of gravity, gravitational fields, turning a generator. That's all it is. So is that violating the second law of thermodynamics? No. You're using a gravitational field. People don't think about these elemental aspects and think deeply.
Do you think that for most of us in here, we will see acknowledgement of ET presence in our lifetime? And do you see the technology challenge you put out there could move separately without acknowledgement of the ET presence?
Good question. She asked if in our lifetime we would see an acknowledgement of an extraterrestrial presence. Ironically, what I just said a moment ago, I think we already have. I think the mass public already think that we're not alone. Now, so you have to then qualify, when will the elites acknowledge it publicly? privately, a lot of the elites that I've been able to meet with will acknowledge it. Oh, yes. But then when you say, will you say that publicly? Oh, no, it's the end of my career. Whether they're a professor or a governmental person or a senator. No one wants to be Senator Moonbeam and ridiculed. So I think that the problem really is defining disclosure. And a lot of people say, when is disclosure going to happen? I said, we've done it already. When I started the project, there was only about 25% of the public thought this was real. Now it's 50, 60%. But in terms of, if your metric is the conventional wisdom, mainstream media, mainstream academia, mainstream governmental entities, your guess is as good as mine. And I'm not holding my breath. However, nor should we. We can go forward with this information independent of that. And that is the beauty of the internet, by the way. Because, you know, I can do a program and reach 1 million, 2 million, 5 million people, whereas the ratings for, you know, Pierce Morgan on CNN is a few 100,000, which is why they had to remove him. But, or Larry King, when I was on Larry King's show. By the way, interestingly, when the media tell you, well, we don't cover this because there's not public interest, after pornography, this is the #1 subject of interest on the internet. It's huge. Moreover, when I was on, I have a letter here from the producer for Larry King Live on the show I was on, you know, 19, 20 years ago, and she said, this is the most watched Larry King special we've ever had. So the metrics, Ancient Aliens for the History, the most lucrative and best franchise. So it isn't because the media wouldn't get numbers or the media wouldn't get lucrative advertising if they covered this. It's because their corporate bosses won't let them. Now, am I speculating? No. Let me tell you what happened with the executive producer of ABC Primetime Live in 2020. Back a few years ago, after the Disclosure Project was launched. And I'm not going to mention his name here, but he's a very nice guy from New York. He had been a producer for Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes and won an Emmy, and then went to New York with ABC News, and was the executive producer for those 2 news magazines, Primetime Live in 2020. And he came out to our farm in Virginia, and I gave him 35 digital hours of military top secret testimony, all the documents he wanted and all the information he wanted. He says, either this is all the biggest hoax I've ever seen, or it's the biggest story of the 20th century. I said, I think you know it's the latter. He says, yeah, it really is amazing. So he went back to New York and then invited me up there, and I saw Sam Donaldson and some other people. And then I got a phone call. Now, before all this happened, I told him, I said, you know, I don't think ABC is going to let you do this. What he wanted to do was a series of news magazines like Town Hall with, you know, a lot of these military and other people there, with them discussing on ABC Prime Time in 2020 what they knew about this, and really blow the lid off this and then make a call for more to come public. So I thought, great, let's do it, but I don't think they will let you. And he says, oh no, I'm the executive producer of this show. So a bit of hubris, okay, and I just smiled and I said, well, let me know how I can help. A couple weeks later, he gives me a call. He says, Dr. Greer, they won't let me do this program. I said, oh, who are they? And he said, Dr. Greer, you know who they are. And that was it. Now, we've stayed in touch periodically since. Same thing with the movie industry, Hollywood. There was a very big producer, multi-billion-dollar guy who's done multi-billion dollars in gross revenues for films. And he sent someone to the 1997 congressional briefings we did that were closed here at the Westin Hotel in Georgetown, where we had all these military, the first sort of wave of these military witnesses who were willing to do this privately. And there were members of this, you know, the chairman of the Government Reform and Oversight Committee, Dan Burton, who issued 1,000 subpoenas on the Monica Lewinsky case, was there. All these people were there. White House people were there. Vice President Al Gore, some of his people. And Pentagon folks. And so he sent, this producer in Hollywood sent his senior person to attend just where nobody would know who she was. And it blew her mind. She went back and she said, this is the real X-Files without the nonsense. So this producer flew me out there, you know, the whole Hollywood two-step limousines, the whole bit. Flies out there, we're meeting at 20th Century Fox in his amazing office. He has a conference room full of people, of writers who've done all these big Oscar-winning movies and Emmy shows. And he says, I have a $60 million discretionary budget with Fox to make any film I want to make, and I want to make this one. I said, I'm not sure they will let you. He says, oh, of course they will. And he told me who he was again. I said, wonderful, glad to hear it. Well, put it together, and I'll cooperate in every way I can. All I want to do is get the information out. I don't want a red cent. I'll give you, you know, you can just pick my brain. I'll give you all the data, all you want. And a couple weeks later, he calls and says, well, Dr. Greer, Fox won't let me do this movie. I said, I thought you said you had complete control over this $60 million. He says, not for this. It has to be a fiction. I said, well, I mean, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was a docudrama. That was fiction, but it was mostly based on true events, by the way. So Steven Spielberg did. And I actually, when I had dinner with one of his family members, and we talked about that, Spielberg's. And so the reality is that people think that Hollywood can do whatever it wants, the big media can do whatever it wants, a corporation in Silicon Valley that might discover this widget that will do this can do whatever it wants. What has happened to our freedoms? And this is, I mean, I know this sounds very kind of libertarian or Jeffersonian, but we have really lost anything resembling a free society on fundamental issues. And that should be of great concern. I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, left, right, socialist, whatever you are, which, you know, I don't subscribe to any of the political divisions, because really this issue transcends all of them. There have been people who are Democrats who love what we're doing. There are people who are Republicans who love what we're doing, and vice versa, who don't like it, depending on where their interests lie and how many checks they're collecting from these special interests, which is a lot. I mean, the oil industry and coal industry, utilities, they spread a lot of money around. It's like big farm. How much healthcare reform can you get when you have a multi-billion-dollar entity that's kind of bribing all the senators and congressmen and what have you? So, but this is that to a much larger degree than even the pharmaceutical industry, much larger. And I think we have to figure out a way to say, look, we're going to continue with acknowledging the ET presence and doing disclosure, and most importantly, I don't want to leave this out of this, it really doesn't matter if we have free energy if we go to interstellar war. We were talking about this at the break. So we need to have people who put out to the public a paradigm for contact that's peaceful, that is multilateral, that isn't polluted with all the usual fear-mongering and stereotypes of all things scary and alien. Because we need to be able to say, if we're already in an interstellar moment, when we are, even if it's not acknowledged fully, who's taking care of that relationship? Not Secretary Kerry at the State Department, not the UN officials I've met, not the people in foreign ministries I've briefed. It is not being tasked to any of them. So we, the people, need to come together and do that. It's like citizens diplomacy, but on an interplanetary level. And that's really why I formed the whole Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, which now has an app for a training app that you can get on your smartphone, but also now this networking app so you can plug into anyone in the community you want to plug into that's near you. And you may have to travel an hour if you live in the remote area of Montana, but you can do that. And I think it's very important for two reasons. One, it shows a face of humanity to these extraterrestrial civilizations that isn't just militaristic and avaricious, greedy. But it also creates its own, as Rupert Sheldrake talks about, morphogenic field, where in consciousness once, it's like the 100th monkey effect. Once a certain number of people start doing something, it begins to propagate non-locally and has an effect that is beyond just a linear one person to another, but actually shifts the great unconscious, if you will. And that is why it's so important for people to do that. So we move our civilization in the direction of universal peace and not interplanetary war. You know, because Douglas MacArthur in his last talk up here in congressional to the Congress said, World War III will be interplanetary. Reagan stood up in front of the UN and said, wouldn't it be easier to unite the world if we had a common alien threat to unite against? Clinton recently, with Jimmy Fallon, made a similar sort of misguided statement. So, you know, there is this tendency that we want to take this issue, and instead of having another race to fight, or economic system to fight, or religion to fight, let's find another planet to fight. Hallelujah! Instead of having world peace that is true world peace, let's unite the world in interplanetary conflict. Well, this is not going forward, my friends. This is a big step backwards. So we need calmer heads and more spiritually minded people to get involved in this, so that our civilization doesn't get tricked into a sort of cosmic 9/11 or a cosmic Gulf of Tonkin. You know, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, when it's been substantially proven we basically exaggerated and staged these attacks on our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin so that Congress and the Johnson administration would be stampeded into expanding the Vietnam War. And that is not a myth. That actually has happened. It was proven to occur. So, you know, we have to be careful, because the public are very easily affected by these sort of misguided patriotism of us versus them, like the movie Independence Day. Let's kick alien butt, and Will Smith. You know, and this is the worst outcome. That's actually a worse outcome than if we have these new technologies and the world gets off oil and becomes united, but then we get maneuvered by these Machiavellian manipulators in the intelligence community into an interplanetary conflict. And I think that that's why there are three big projects that I've been focused on. The original one is the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, whose motto is one universe, one people. Because on the basis of just sentient conscious mind, the deep spiritual aspect of ourselves, we're all one being. But that led to the Disclosure Project because of the near landing event and sighting that happened in Gulf Breeze and Pensacola in the 90s. And now we're at this point of working on the technology. So those three components are really key to what we want to achieve. But the heart of it is really contact, peaceful contact with citizen diplomats. Wow, well, we're really in the deep end of the pond. He's asking what is the connection between what some people would call the ascended masters or very enlightened beings who've left their bodies or in other dimensions and realms, and these extraterrestrial beings. I would say it's the same connection, but perhaps more intimate, that humans can have. Now, the difference is, if you are an interstellar civilization, if you guys could be quiet out there, thanks. If you're an interstellar civilization, you're going to be able to go from one star system to another only if you have become cosmologically competent. Now, what do I mean by that? I wrote a paper back in 1995, I believe, called ETs and the New Cosmology, that talks about this expanded view of the cosmology of a universe that includes other dimensions and other realms that are increasingly conscious. And this explains a lot of the experiences people have when they're near an extraterrestrial vehicle, where it will have an effect in consciousness. And they will begin to have, similar to the ending of the movie Contact that Jodie Foster was in, where it's almost like in a dream state. Why is that? Well, when you start dealing with technologies that permit not only transportation but communication beyond the light barrier, let's look at it that way, beyond the box of space-time, then you're moved into a world that is increasingly conscious and in the thought realm. And for that reason, those civilizations that are interstellar are very, very familiar with what we would call remote viewing, the ability to have the mind awaken into this field of consciousness that's non-local and see other points in space or time, but also other beings and other worlds. Can that be done electronically? Yes. The big secret in the intelligence community that I learned back in 1994 was that the remote viewing programs that the CIA and NSA had that were based purely on meditative and consciousness efforts was the part they were happy to let the people know about. But that in I believe it was 1956, a man that I met before he passed away had invented some electronics that would permit some of these operatives in the intelligence community to electronically hook up and literally see through other dimensions in consciousness, other places. And that was the high end of the so-called remote viewing programs that were based on trans-dimensional electronic systems, which I understand very, very well, and which have been used since the 50s. So if we have that in our classified programs, I'm quite sure that an interstellar civilization has things that would be generation 100 of that. And that would mean, and answering your question in a way that has some foundation in logic, that their ability to perceive these other dimensions and realms would be augmented. Now, that is limited by the level of consciousness of the perceiver. So what that means is everything is really, in that sense, based on what your level of development in consciousness is. So if you have developed the ability to be in a state of transcendent cosmic awareness, you can perceive a certain amount beyond space and time. If you've gotten to the point that you can see the finest aspects of that, what in the Vedas are called celestial perception, you're going to be able to sense that. If you can see beyond that, then you're in this what's called the state of unity consciousness. And it goes on, and that's just the beginning. But so those abilities of perception are very much dependent on the level of consciousness of the perceiver. So it would vary with different civilizations and what their capabilities are, but certainly their capabilities would be beyond what we are able to actuate through AT&T. In other words, just a linear electromagnetic communication system. And you know, years ago when I was had this meeting with the CIA director and his wife, which they subsequently denied, but luckily I have the documents, I have it sitting right here that can prove it happened. I always joke in Washington, how do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. So, more truth to that than people want to realize. But at any rate, the wife of the CIA director was a scientist and was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and she asked me over dinner, we were there, it was a 3-hour meeting almost, my wife was with me and can verify this, and she asked, not that question, but she asked, how are these civilizations communicating across the vastness of interstellar space? And I thought, oh God, do I tell her the truth and lose all credibility? Or do I tell her something that sounds scientific, but that I know is rubbish? And I decided then that I don't care how high the person's status in society was, if they asked the question, they deserve an honest answer. So I explained to her that, and I think this is something people really need to understand about these technologies. A great launching point from these sort of technologies that can bring us to the next level of our civilization to eliminate poverty, pollution, et cetera, and so on, and the geopolitical morass of oil politics. But when you start dealing with these sciences on a more profound level, you break into these trans-dimensional physics that deal with communication systems. And I explained that, look at our galaxy, the Milky Way, is only one of billions of galaxies. It's a very average spiral galaxy. The Andromeda galaxy is 2.5 million light years away, which is the distance of a beam of light going 186,000 miles per second, would travel for 2.5 million years. But let's take our own galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So that's the distance, a beam of light going 186,000 miles every second. Every second is 186,000 miles for 100,000 years. Okay, but that's just our own galaxy. So let's say that there's a star system 1,000 light years away, which is only 1% of the distance from where we are, because we're on one of the outer spiral arms of the galaxy. 1%, 1,000 light years. Using your cell phone or a radio wave, anything at the speed of light, it would take 1,000 years to get a signal there to that home planet, and 1,000 years to get an answer back. It's the time since the birth of Christ to say, hello, how are you? Fine, thank you very much. So what I explained to the CIA director and his wife is that the speed of light's just too slow. So the communication, as well as transportation systems that allow for them to be here, are something that are beyond linearity, that cross over into non-locality. What Einstein called the spooky phenomenon, where two things materialize and can appear at two different places instantly, and that kind of thing. So this non-locality in physics, when it's put into a reproducible electromagnetic system, can then cross through these dimensions so that the star system 1,000 light years from us and Earth can be, get it, in resonance. There's no distance. Linearity is gone. That line between here and there is gone. And you're going not through a wormhole, but you're actually going through these dimensions that are folded within time and space, where the speed of light, time, mass, and those things do not factor into the equations. Does that make sense? And therefore, one of the things that I discovered years ago, Dr. Robert Woods, who's one of our Disclosure Project witnesses who had worked with McDonnell Douglas, that was then bought by Boeing, he was very interested in an assessment I did in 1991, back in my misspent youth, so when I was in my 30s. And in this paper, which was called the Comprehensive Assessment of the UFO ETI, Extraterrestrial Intelligence Subject. It was sort of a white paper, and it's in my first book that you can get on the internet at our store. And in that, I described TAC, Technology Assisted Consciousness, and CAT, Consciousness Assisted Technologies, so that you can have a technology, as I was saying, that assists consciousness and thought. For example, that was what that 1956 invention that this genius that I had met had invented, that ended up getting bought out by a front company for the CIA, can do. Or you can have your consciousness assist the technology, say for communication. So it goes both ways. So it's the interface between thought stuff, say a thoughtron instead of an electron, and this dimension. But it's very, very sophisticated technologies. And that's what these civilizations are using for communication. But that also means that they're traversing into these other dimensions that some would call, that you might experience when you have a near-death experience, or when you have a lucid. How many people have had a lucid flying dream where you're flying? Almost everyone. Well, you know, actually what's happening in those lucid flying dreams, and particularly if it crosses over into a precognitive dream, you're actually in that aspect of yourself that is conscious, and the so-called body of light is actually no longer restricted by the confines of the body and space-time, and therefore you can actually traverse these kind of worlds of light and see what's going to happen tomorrow. But imagine being able to do that on a reproducible basis with electronic assist, all right? And your whole then spacecraft does the whole thing because it transitions out of linear space-time. So that would mean that the ability to explore those other dimensions would be greatly augmented. It doesn't mean that it's more than we can experience, because people have experienced near-death experiences and other dimensions and what have you, either in meditation or near-death experiences or just spontaneously, in sort of an awakening that happens in consciousness. But it also means that if you're an interstellar civilization, you're going to have a means to assist with that and augment that and facilitate it on a reproducible basis. But again, even for them, the perceptual capabilities are limited by the level of consciousness of the perceiver, because you get into finer and finer and finer and finer and finer dimensions. Someone once asked me, how many dimensions are there? I said, how many numbers are there between 0 and infinity? So it's infinity within infinity within infinity. There's not any limit. So what we're trying to explore in our little project, well, and of course this is actually how I got involved in all these issues, is 6 months after my near-death experience, I had learned meditation because I was going, wow, I was raised very devout atheist, science, and we were very devout atheists. You weren't allowed to believe in anything you couldn't put in a test tube. And so when I had that experience, it was so profound, and it was so cosmic in awareness that I began to learn meditation techniques. And I picked one that was sort of a Vedic mantra technique. And I began to have all these experiences. And I was up on this mountaintop in North Carolina, and I was going to meditate, and one of these spacecraft materialized just before sunset. Same spacecraft I'd seen when I was 8 or 9 years old in Charlotte, North Carolina, as a little boy. And I went, oh, they're back. I didn't think anything else more about it. And it was there, and then it just vanished. It didn't fly off. I went, oh, cool. So I was there meditating and sitting on this mountaintop in October. It was freezing up there. I had a jacket on, a ski jacket. And I went into such a beautiful state of consciousness that I lost all track of time. There was no time. Transcended into this pure conscious state. Sitting up at 5,000 feet up in the mountains of North Carolina, I love. I think it's my Cherokee. I'm part Cherokee Indian, so I have this great love for those mountains. And so at the end, I kind of stood up and I looked at the sky, and it was like this beautiful thought came, behold what a beautiful universe God has made. And with that, I went into the same state I was in when I had my near-death experience, but I was in my body. And then there was this little E.T. beside me that touched me on my right shoulder, and all my hair stood on end. Now, that's when I had some hair, or more hair, and it was longer. I mean, this is 1974. So it was a wonderful experience, but that was I didn't understand the physics of what had happened in terms of the contact that ensued and followed, but now I do. And I think that it's an amazing science that unfortunately, we're just beginning to emerge out of sort of a Newtonian fossil fuel, trying to come out of that. But there's so much more progress that's been made in classified scientific programs. Now, you can imagine hearing a little bit of this, why these folks at the CIA call some of these technologies WSFM, weird science and frickin' magic, and why the parent group operating on the NRO document, that's the first document in the Obama briefing, is from the National Reconnaissance Office, which runs all the super secret spy satellites. And you'll see it says MAJIC, magic, is one of the compartmented operations. Cosmic Ops, Magic Ops, boom. That's an authentic document. And it's because and there's an area of Nellis Air Force Base, which people mistakenly call Area 51. No one in the know calls it that, by the way. Nobody. That is called Dreamland. And this document mentions Dreamland MOC, a military operating center. And one of the reasons why that crept into the parlance of people doing experiments with these electronics is that when you're in that state using those, it is like having a lucid flying dream. That's where Dreamland came from. Now there's a little secret that you won't hear many places, but it makes sense if you understand what a lucid dream is, if you understand what the conscious aspect of the cosmos is, if you understand what thought really is and thought forms are. It all begins to make sense. And so when McDonnell Douglas, old man McDonald of McDonnell Douglas, asked, I'm getting to another point here, asked Dr. Wood to go and look at this subject. He started finding cases, and he found a number of cases where people had contact events with objects, and this is way back in the 60s when this was happening more often because there weren't the weapon systems we have now targeting extraterrestrial vehicles. People would have these experiences, and in broad daylight sometimes. There was one case that he looked into, I think it was in the Baja California, where a craft had landed, there were these beings outside of it. They had a little, they were very much in this dimension, and they had a little black, sort of like a communication thing, that would directly communicate with thought instead of with words. But not just like, oh, I'm going to guess an intuitive telepathic, you know, the amazing Kreskin nonsense. But I mean, zap, just like, but it was clearly into the oral cortex coming from these electronics. And Dr. Wood, who's an aerospace engineering guy, Cornell guy, reported this back, and there was a reason why a lot of the early McDonnell Douglas secret stuff, the Phantom Works, and they had a lot of his planes named after these sort of concepts. I forget the names of them, some of them. It's all very historic, you can look it up. But that goes back to the 60s. And here we are 50 years later, still dealing with rather primitive concepts of physics. So that's why when you start thinking about civilizations, let's say a civilization's been around for hundreds of thousands to millions of years longer than we have, which in a universe is 14 billion years old, there's no reason why not. And you take the technological advances that have been made in the last 100 years, not just the things most people know about, but these classified programs. And then you put that on an exponential curve for hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Every manifestation of that civilization would look like magic. More so than if you went back and visited Thomas Jefferson 200 years ago out here at Monticello and showed him an iPhone or something. This would be less spectacular than the normal everyday world of these interstellar civilizations, which is why we have to have a sense of humility scientifically. That the fact is that we're just on the very beginnings of scientific and conscious exploration. And everyone thinks history is over, and every generation of scientists thinks they know everything. But we don't. And so there has to be the acknowledgement that we're just beginning on this journey. Now, in the realm of mystic literature and people who've had experiences in consciousness, I think many things that have been portrayed as miracles actually they're certainly miraculous to the people who saw it, but there's probably an understanding both in the science of consciousness, but maybe even in technological sciences that would explain it. That people don't want to hear this part, but because this steps on some theological toes. No, so one of the issues about disclosure and this whole issue, you're not just stepping on the toes of the orthodoxy of science, macroeconomics, and technology, but you might step on some theological toes when you start moving into some of this discussion, which is, get you in hot water very quickly. But, and I've been in enough of hot water to know whereof I speak in terms of that paradigm. But, it's okay. I remember years ago I was meeting with a man at JPL. He tracked me down at a restaurant, actually, Jet Propulsion Labs, and he started talking to me about the fact that he had seen the non-sanitized images from Mars, where there were structures, very ancient structure. And even Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, has recently said, we need to go back there and see some of these obelisks, these big objects that appear to be artificial. He can't talk about what he saw at the moon because he's been told he can't, but he can talk about these other things that he's looked into, which is why he has begun to speak about it. So this is a very interesting case because I said, well, why don't you at least disclose that? Because some of these structures apparently are very ancient, as in the millions of years possibly old. Now, that would make sense. I mean, the Earth's been here for 4.6 billion years. The solar system is billions of years old, so millions of years is not that much. And he said, oh no. He says, because even though it's not something that would point to any contemporary, he said, if that knowledge was disclosed, it would collapse the fundamentalist and orthodox belief systems of every religion on earth. And I said, well, good. It's childhood's in. I mean, fine. He says, no, you don't understand how powerful those interests are. And this is a scientist saying this. This is not someone at the Vatican. So part of the problem with disclosure is that it opens up a whole bunch of issues that people would rather just not deal with. And this is one of them, including this question of other dimensions and intelligence that aren't physical. Now, this is a really important thing about the issue. People get into what I call cosmological indigestion. They can't digest. So you can have an experience with an interstellar civilization that has trans-dimensional capabilities that cross into this realm of thought and consciousness and what have you. That's what we do when we go out under the stars with my team. But then you could have also an experience with intelligences that are not from a star system, but that are from just other dimensions and realms that are purely conscious in the worlds of light, as it's called. And you could be forgiven for confusing the two, because depending on how they manifest. Now, I had a hilarious conversation with this senior theologian at the Vatican a few years ago. He's actually in the Disclosure Project material, but we didn't have good translation for Italian. And he said, look, he says, angels don't need flying saucers. I said, yes, of course, but there's a point where when an interstellar vehicle resonantly shifts into that dimension, depending on their capabilities, they get very close to that realm, don't they? And he said, yes. So there is an understanding of it, but most people will conflate one experience with another, so that anything that is weird or goes bump in the night, they're going to think is the same phenomenon, when it's a multiplicity of phenomena, plural.
Was the Time and Space Lab when it still existed in the U.S. and then was shut down by, I guess, the Feds?
I know people who work, I don't know that particular lab name. I know people who've worked with, very high voltage experiments in space-time bubbles, as it were, dealing with that. Yes. Yeah. And that is not a myth, and that is, you can do that. And that begins to bring up the question of phasing in this science. The attitude now is, let's not open Pandora's box, keep it all secret. Meanwhile, the Earth is dying. And I think that it does present, however, a conundrum, which I had a conversation with a colonel who was in charge of, the euphemism is future technologies for the Air Force, which means they have it already. And I was at a private meeting here in the D.C. area, and he pulled me aside. He said, these technologies can be weaponized. I said, oh, yes, I know, and they already have been by elements that are out of control and aren't under the control of the President and the Congress. And he says, yes, but so we can't let this be known. And I said, here's the big conundrum of our time. If these technologies come out and they're used for malevolent weapons purposes, very dangerous. If they don't come out and our only solution ends up being things that are fracking and gas and just pumping more stuff out of the earth and burning up the atmosphere, that's an existential problem. So we're in an existential crisis where the only path forward is to have people who are wise and the public being educated, where these technologies are brought out and are strictly limited to non-weapons applications, and that is enforced absolutely strictly. How do you do that? Well, you can't do it by causing the international community to have no say-so. At the same time, there's always going to be some sociopathic leader of some country, some madman, who will want to do something. And that's what the intelligence community worries about. So that is not a trivial concern. And I do not dismiss it because I am not a trivial person, frankly. However, the secrecy is killing us. So, and the disclosure of all this, not only information and the contact component of it, but also that we're not alone in the cosmos, which is an enormous disclosure. But the technological, let's say, basket, there's a basket with all kinds of different technologies that are classified. At least the generation 1.0 ones that would get us off fossil fuels should come out. Then let's have a discussion. And I made this agreement with people in the intelligence community that I would not work on the ones that disrupt space-time, that are weaponized, or that would result in lift. Now, a lot of people don't like that when they hear that because they want to have something like the George Jetson. I want my car to float and go. I said someday. But the anti-gravity, as it's called in pop culture, but the electromagnetic-gravitic component of this, which is a very high voltage system that causes the lift effect because that whole spacecraft has a charge around it, creates kind of a space-time bubble, and becomes essentially massless, or close to massless, so very light. Although when it sets down, it's very heavy. When it's full, when that system is shut off, it'll bend a railroad tie. It's so heavy, weighs tons. But when it's just like, it looks like it's floating, which essentially it is. That technology has obvious, shall we say, missile and Air Force applications. And that's why I've said at this point, I'm happy to leave that alone. So even when that's been offered to me, and it has been, in fact, I recently received a bunch of blueprints from a grandchild of a man who worked on the early anti-grav devices. I have it in my vault. We have it. But that's for a later phase. Now, we're running out of time to come out with a generation 1.0 energy system, which can be done and configured. So it's a stationary object that's not doing anything that's too magical, but just is creating, quote, free energy from the zero-point field that pulls the civilization off the death spiral it's in with the current geopolitical and geophysical crisis with fossil fuels. But let's at least do that. I always tell people, let's crawl before we walk, and walk before we run, and run before we levitate. All right? But we're on our backs right now. Our civilization's on its back, not even rolling around like a 3-month-old. We need to get up and at least start moving in this correct direction. And that's why I feel it's very important for us to be honest. I try to be as honest as I can with people about the implications of some of the far end of this technology being something that is worrisome if it were in the wrong hands. And that brings up the bigger question of, isn't the crisis really a social, spiritual, cultural crisis in consciousness? The consciousness of wanting to take whatever we invent and weaponize it to gain dominion over someone else or some other culture. That is at the root the fundamental problem. And that is a spiritual problem and a psychological and cultural, sociological problem that we have to address at the same time. But we're running out of time to do it sequentially. Because here's the conundrum. How do you create a peaceful world where everyone's singing Kumbaya when half the world's population is in dire poverty and there are 30-some people who have more than half of the net worth of the world in their control? This is not something that is a sustainable system. But so at some point we have to break out of that. I look at it as sort of this cul-de-sac that we've been in for 100 years. Sort of a blind, dead-end street we've been running around in circles. And the technology, I know that I work with a lot of people who, been in Silicon Valley and various, what we call high-tech sector. I just go, not high-tech. This is high-tech. There's nothing high-tech about a smartphone or a computer at all. And by the way, they're plugged into a coal-fired power grid from the 1800s. So a little perspective here is necessary, and that is part of the problem is that we're trying to catch up on 100, I call it the lost century. Great title for a book and a video, by the way, but the lost century. There's a lost century of not just technological development, but sociological, economic, cultural development because of the suppression of this area of science and information. And because of that, we've kind of run out how much time we have before. It's like a rubber band that you can, time is like a rubber band. You can stretch it out or it can contract. But we pulled this rubber band about as far as it can until it snaps. And the snap can be a geopolitical crisis, war, or it can be a geophysical crisis where we have both polar ice caps melting, or what have you. But ultimately, we're at that point, and I'm not trying to sound at all apocalyptic, but I'm just saying that as the Chinese saying goes, unless we change directions, we're likely to end up where we're going. So where the trend lines are very disturbing. And everyone kind of is diverted into the internet, and they all think that that's, oh, we're doing such great technology. But there's nothing. Your car is a 1800s internal combustion engine, literally from the 1800s. Trains, mid-1800s. A nuclear power plant is a steam engine. Basically, you're getting heat from splitting the atom. You're boiling water, creating steam that turns a turbine, a la the 1800s. You just have all this nuclear waste. Most people don't know. You're not getting energy directly from the atom. It's just heat to boil water. That's why I have these huge cooling towers. And if you think that's not a problem, go visit Fukushima. And then you have jets. Well, jets were invented in the 1930s. So those of you who flew here on a jet, you were flying on a souped-up version of a 1930s jet engine. And rockets, Wernher von Braun, 1940s for the V-2 rocket. Every technological breakthrough in energy and propulsion since the 40s has been classified. So now we're running on 70 years of this secrecy, which is, as Eisenhower predicted, run amok. But in the classified world, as you rightly point out, there are programs that have gone apace. I mean, they're on generation 500 of stuff that most people can't even believe would exist. Their eyes would roll back. Even the physicists at MIT, their eyes would roll back. So we at least need to catch up with, say, 1920. I mean, so people think what I'm proposing is very bold. I said, I'm really very moderate about saying where we're trying to catch up to. But most people don't know the history, this lost century, that at the cost of secrecy and an out-of-control national security state that has gotten hybridized and placed mainly in the corporate world. All the big action is corporate. All right, SAIC, Booz Allen Hamilton, Lockheed, my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman. He was with Grumman when they developed the lunar module, et cetera, and so on. And so MITRE Corporation, BAE Systems. These are all. So if you get the $100 to $200 billion missing out of the U.S. Treasury every year, going into these corporate entities through a front door program that's really a shell. It's like the mafia using a restaurant to launder their money, and then it goes into a backdoor black project, unacknowledged special access project, which is the proper term. And that's that. When Eisenhower said beware the military-industrial complex, it was a little bit of money. Rumsfeld, as you've seen in the film Sirius, back in the day before 9/11, said it's $2.3 trillion unaccounted for. Trillion. Now, since 9/11, the amount of spending in that sector has gone way up. So it's an enormous amount of funding and resources that are going into projects. Now, the president and members of Congress or Senator Feinstein has to pretend like they know everything that these corporations and entities are doing, because after all, the emperor doesn't want to admit he has no clothes. No, and this was one of the things that was pointed out to me in meeting with the CI director and other people, is that no president wants to admit that there's this big permanent infrastructure running apace, siphoning off hundreds of billions, $2.3 trillion in funding that neither the president nor the oversight committees of the Congress over here have any knowledge of. No one wants to admit that. Well, but why? Because it would create this constitutional crisis like we've never seen. And we're seeing a little bit of that with Senator Feinstein kind of mud wrestling with the CIA over the torture stuff. But this would be that 1,000 times more difficult and complex. So I've had members of the Senate and members of the Senate Intelligence Committee I've met with in the past who've gone, we've suspected these things are going on, but we are never briefed on them.